It was a machine of wheels and wires, a small box of polished metal and baker-like keys that carried with it the fate of nations. The Enigma machine, born in secrecy and shrouded in complexity, became the silent weapon of Nazi Germany, a cipher so intricate that its messages seemed unbreakable. With every keystroke, orders for armies, fleets, and U-boats vanished into a fog of coded language, giving Hitler and his commanders the confidence that their plans were secure. To crack it seemed impossible, and for years Allied intelligence watched helplessly as convoys were sunk and soldiers died, their movements betrayed by codes no one could read. But in hidden huts, in the quiet halls of Bletchley Park, a different kind of war was being fought, not with guns or tanks, but with pencils, paper, logic, and the first machines that would one day give birth to the computer age. It was a battle of minds against machines, of secrecy against persistence, of mathematics against tyranny. The men and women who joined this clandestine fight worked in silence, their victories hidden from the world, their triumphs known only to a handful of generals. Without them, the war may have lasted years longer, costing countless more lives. With them, the tide of the Second World War began to turn, not on the beaches, but in the cryptic dance of numbers and letters. This is the story of Enigma, its invention, its use, its breaking, and its legacy, not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of human ingenuity, rising to meet the darkest of challenges. And as we dive into this journey, whether you're listening late at night from London, New York, Sydney, or anywhere in the world, drop a comment with where you're tuning in and what time it is there. I'd love to know where our global community is keeping history alive. Long before the roar of tanks and the whir of aircraft filled the skies of the 20th century, wars were fought with whispers, secrets, and hidden messages. Ancient generals understood that victory was not only measured in battles won on fields, but in the silent war of information carried between commanders. In the 5th century BCE, the Spartans used the citale, a staff around which parchment was wound so that letters written across its length could only be read on a rod of identical diameter. To their enemies, the message looked like gibberish, but in Spartan hands it was a precise instrument of war. The Romans advanced the art with the Caesar cipher, a simple but effective method of shifting letters by a fixed number in the alphabet. Legions marching across Europe carried orders disguised in these coded forms, confident that the enemy would not easily break them. In China, during the Han Dynasty, military officials used more complex substitution ciphers, showing that the instinct to conceal messages spanned civilizations. What united them all was the understanding that secrets had power, and to lose them was to risk defeat. From the start, cryptography was as much a weapon as any sword or spear. As centuries passed, cryptography evolved alongside the growing complexity of politics and war. During the Renaissance, when kingdoms balanced fragile alliances and plotted betrayal, codes became essential to diplomacy. Italian city-states, like Venice and Florence, employed professional cipher secretaries, trusted with messages that could decide the fate of empires. The Medici family relied on complex substitution ciphers, knowing that rivals lurked everywhere and that one intercepted letter could mean ruin. Across Europe, monarchs like Francis I of France and Henry VIII of England poured resources into creating and breaking ciphers, turning encryption into a true statecraft tool. Papal envoys carried elaborate ciphers to disguise instructions from Rome, while ambassadors devised personal codebooks that required intricate keys to decipher. Courts invested in ever more complicated systems, some replacing entire words with symbols, others using multiple substitution alphabets. Yet, as the codes grew more complex, so too did the methods for breaking them. Cryptography became a race, with secrecy and exposure locked in eternal struggle. In this Renaissance intrigue, the modern intelligence war was being born. By the 17th century, cryptography was no longer an art reserved only for courtiers, but a discipline honed by mathematicians and philosophers. In France, Cardinal Richelieu established a cabinet noir, or black chamber, where intercepted letters were opened, copied, and resealed without their recipients ever suspecting. These secret offices recruited some of the finest minds of the age, men who could spend hours untangling patterns hidden in ciphertext. Frequency analysis, the discovery that certain letters in a language occur more often than others, became the key to unlocking substitution ciphers. An encrypted text might look impenetrable, but a patient analyst could use the distribution of letters to slowly unravel its secrets. This technique, first formalized by Arab scholars centuries earlier, spread into Europe, changing the balance of cryptographic war. Governments that once trusted unbreakable ciphers found themselves exposed by those with sharper intellects and longer patience. The secrecy of kings, popes, and generals was suddenly far more fragile than they had imagined, and the cryptographic duel between codemakers and codebreakers entered a new age of sophistication. The 18th century carried cryptography into the age of revolutions and empires, where the stakes were higher than ever. During the American Revolution, George Washington relied heavily on ciphers and invisible inks to coordinate with his officers and agents. Benedict Arnold's treachery and the capture of Major André revealed how dangerous a single broken code could be. In Europe, the Napoleonic Wars became a crucible of cryptographic innovation as French and British intelligence sought to outmaneuver one another in dispatches. Napoleon himself employed a great cipher developed by the Rossignols, a family of French cryptographers whose system replaced entire syllables with numbers. It was so effective that its secrets remained unsolved for over a century after his defeat. Yet even in this era, the limitations of manual ciphers grew evident. Messages were slow to encrypt and decrypt, vulnerable to capture, and dependent on the diligence of officers in the field. Cryptography had become indispensable to modern warfare, but it was still fragile, prone to human error, and constrained by the limits of pen and paper. The stage was being set for something more mechanical, more adaptable, and far more dangerous. By the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution reshaped the world, cryptography began to absorb the logic of machines. Telegraphy changed everything, compressing communication into short, rapid bursts of dots and dashes sent across vast distances. The speed of transmission created new vulnerabilities, for a message intercepted on a wire could travel just as quickly to an enemy. Nations invested in more elaborate cipher systems, from polyalphabetic substitutions to numerical codes, designed to keep pace with the accelerating flow of information. During the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces relied heavily on telegraphic ciphers, using simple transpositions and substitution keys. But Confederate reliance on predictable patterns allowed Union codebreakers to penetrate their messages, gaining insights that influenced the course of campaigns. The battlefield was no longer defined only by muskets and cannons. It was now shaped by information moving faster than soldiers could march. And in this era, cryptography became the unseen hand that could tip the balance of entire wars. The closing decades of the 19th century brought the first stirrings of electromechanical cryptography, innovations that foreshadowed Enigma. Inventors experimented with mechanical devices that used rotating disks or sliding components to transform plain text into complex ciphers. The concept of polyalphabetic substitution, once managed by human effort, was now embedded into the gears and wheels of machines. One such device was the Haben rotor machine, developed in the United States, which used a rotating disk to change the alphabet automatically with each key press. Though flawed, it demonstrated the promise of machines that could create staggering layers of encryption far beyond the capacity of a human clerk. European inventors followed suit, producing prototypes that combined mechanical ingenuity with mathematical complexity. Banks, corporations, and militaries began to take note, seeing in these devices the potential to secure vast networks of communication. Yet these early machines were cumbersome, expensive, and prone to mechanical failure. The idea was ahead of its time, but it pointed unmistakably toward the future. And it was in this fertile soil that Enigma would eventually take root. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it new threats that demanded unbreakable secrecy. Wireless communication, first hailed as a miracle, soon revealed itself as a dangerous vulnerability. Messages transmitted by radio waves could be intercepted by anyone with a receiver, no matter how far from the source. The First World War drove home the peril, as both Allied and Central powers raced to intercept, decipher, and exploit enemy communications. The Zimmerman telegram, decoded by British intelligence, lured the United States into the war and demonstrated how a single message could alter history. Cipher clerks worked around the clock, using codebooks, additive tables, and transpositions to guard their nation's secrets. But human error remained a constant threat. Messages mistyped, reused keys, and predictable formats gave openings to skilled codebreakers. The war proved that cryptography was no longer peripheral, it was central to survival. And it left inventors convinced that only machines could provide the complexity and speed required in the new age. As the 1920s dawned, cryptography stood at a crossroads between tradition and revolution. Manual systems still dominated, but their flaws had been exposed on every battlefield of the previous war. The growing web of global trade, diplomacy, and military alliances demanded secure communication that could withstand both interception and analysis. Inventors in Europe and America worked feverishly to refine electromechanical devices, embedding mathematical principles into wheels, rotors, and plugboards. Banks and corporations experimented with machines to protect financial transfers, while militaries quietly recognized their potential for the battlefield. Among these inventors was a German engineer named Arthur Scherbius, whose patented rotor machine would soon become infamous under the name Enigma. To its creators, it was the answer to the vulnerabilities of the past, a device so complex it seemed impregnable. To its users, it promised the power of absolute secrecy, a shield for empire and ambition, and to its adversaries, it would become the greatest cryptographic challenge of the modern age. Thus, from centuries of ciphers scratched on parchment and codes whispered in candlelit chambers, a new era was about to begin. The age of Enigma was at hand. In the aftermath of the First World War, Europe was a continent haunted by both devastation and innovation. The conflict had not only redrawn borders, but also accelerated technology at a pace no one had predicted. Wireless communication, once a scientific novelty, had become the bloodstream of armies and navies, carrying orders that determined the fate of millions. Yet the war had also revealed the fragility of those transmissions, with ciphers broken and codes exploited to devastating effect. The Zimmerman telegram had shown the power of interception to change the course of nations, and no military planner could forget that lesson. Into this fragile world stepped Arthur Scherbius, a German electrical engineer, with a vision shaped by both mathematics and mechanics. Scherbius believed that the future of secrecy lay not in codebooks and clerks, but in machines that could outpace the patience of any codebreaker. He dreamed of a device that could transform plain words into an endless maze of shifting letters, never repeating, never predictable. In 1918, as the guns of war fell silent, He filed a patent for a cipher machine that promised exactly that. It would soon be known by a single ominous name, Enigma. Arthur Scherbius was no soldier, but an innovator, educated in engineering at Hanover and Munich. He possessed both the imagination of an inventor and the meticulous rigor of a mathematician. Germany's defeat in 1918 had left the nation searching for renewal, and Scherbius saw in cryptography not only a business opportunity, but a patriotic contribution. His invention was based on a principle at once elegant and confounding: rotors, wired disks, that scrambled letters electrically and shifted position after each keystroke. This meant that a single pressed key did not always produce the same result. A might become D on one stroke, then X the next. By chaining multiple rotors together, Scherbius multiplied the complexity exponentially, creating millions upon millions of possible combinations. To the casual observer, the device looked like a typewriter, encased in a sturdy wooden box, with a keyboard, a lampboard, and a set of interchangeable rotors inside. But beneath its simplicity lay a labyrinth of electrified logic. It was, in many ways, the first marriage of machine and mathematics in the service of secrecy, and Scherbius was convinced it could change the world. At first, the Enigma machine was marketed not to armies but to banks, corporations, and diplomats. Scherbius founded the firm Chiffrier Maschinen AG in Berlin to commercialize his invention, believing that businesses too had secrets worth guarding. Financial institutions needed to protect transactions, shipping companies needed to secure cargo manifests, and governments required confidentiality in negotiations. The machine was promoted as a tool for modern commerce, a way to keep competitors from prying into sensitive information. Early models were bulky and expensive, costing far more than traditional ciphers, but they carried with them an aura of futuristic security. Scherbius and his partners took them to trade shows, demonstrated them in offices, and courted ministries with the promise of impenetrable communication. The pitch was simple but compelling. With Enigma, no rival could intercept your words, and no spy could steal your plans. Customers, however, were slow to adopt, daunted by the machine's complexity and price. Yet in military circles, interest stirred quietly, and that quiet interest would soon transform Scherbius's invention into something far greater than he had imagined. The Enigma's genius lay in its adaptability, and Scherbius quickly modified the design to suit different markets. Early versions, known as commercial Enigma A and B, used simple rotors without plugboards, offering moderate security but easy operation. By the mid-1920s, the Enigma C and D models introduced more sophisticated wiring, making them vastly more difficult to break. These machines were sold internationally, with customers ranging from the Dutch Navy to Swedish commercial firms. The portability of the device, carried in a compact case, powered by batteries, usable in the field, made it attractive to militaries considering modernization. Unlike codebooks, which could be captured, burned, or stolen, Enigma allowed endless variations that could change daily, even hourly. Scherbius emphasized this advantage in his demonstrations, showing how the machine could generate billions of permutations, far beyond human analysis. The German Navy took particular notice, intrigued by the potential to secure fleet communications in an age of wireless interception. By the late 1920s, military adoption began to grow steadily, and with that adoption, Enigma was transformed from a curiosity into a weapon of secrecy. For the German Reichswehr, reeling under the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, Enigma offered both practical and symbolic value. Versailles had shackled Germany's ability to rearm openly, but technology provided a pathway to covert strength. Secure communication was essential for rebuilding military power in secrecy, and Enigma promised just that. Military modifications created sturdier versions with extra rotors and eventually the crucial plugboard, or steckerbrett. This plugboard added another layer of encryption, allowing pairs of letters to be swapped before and after passing through the rotor system. The result was staggering. With 3 rotors and a plugboard, Enigma produced over 150 trillion possible combinations. To German officers it seemed unbreakable, a fortress of secrecy contained within a wooden box. Messages could now be sent confidently over wireless channels, shielded from foreign ears. The Reichswehr quietly integrated the machine into its growing networks, testing it in maneuvers and refining its usage. And in doing so, Germany unknowingly set the stage for one of the greatest battles of intelligence in history. Arthur Scherbius did not live to see the full militarization of his creation. He died in 1929, the victim of a tragic horse carriage accident in Berlin. To him, Enigma had been both an entrepreneurial gamble and a vision of future secrecy. He likely imagined a world where banks, companies, and diplomats safeguarded their interests with his machine. He could not have foreseen that it would become the lifeblood of German military communications, saturating every branch of the armed forces by the outbreak of the Second World War. His death left the company in the hands of successors who continued to refine and mass-produce the device. By then, the German Army and Navy had already standardized Enigma for wide use, confident in its unassailable complexity. To Scherbius's contemporaries, his machine was a triumph of German engineering, a marvel of precision as impressive as any automobile or radio. But within a decade, its name would carry far darker associations. Enigma would no longer be a commercial product, it would be the cipher of war, and the battlefield it shaped would stretch far beyond the reach of any soldier's rifle. The spread of Enigma was not confined to Germany alone, for its commercial variants traveled quietly across Europe. Diplomats from Spain, Italy, and even Japan purchased versions of the machine, intrigued by its promise of secrecy. Some of these exports would later give Allied cryptographers crucial opportunities to study Enigma's mechanics, though at the time the significance was barely noticed. The Swiss used it in banking, the Dutch experimented with it for naval codes, and companies toyed with its use in international trade. Each sale spread fragments of Scherbius's invention into new hands, fragments that would later matter in the great code-breaking efforts. Yet the Germans maintained the most advanced versions for themselves, reserving military-grade machines with plugboards and additional rotors. These refinements made their Enigma vastly more secure than anything sold abroad. As the 1930s progressed, Enigma became synonymous not with commerce but with power, secrecy, and empire. It became a symbol of modernity in a nation determined to rebuild its strength, and in the shadows, rival nations began to take notice. What began as a commercial curiosity had become a cornerstone of German military doctrine by the dawn of the 1930s. Secure communication was the skeleton of modern mechanized warfare, and Enigma offered a backbone strong enough to carry the weight. It allowed generals to command divisions across continents, admirals to direct fleets across oceans, and the Luftwaffe to coordinate raids across borders. Without Enigma, Germany's vision of rapid, coordinated warfare would have been impossible to sustain. The machine was small enough to fit into a field officer's pack, durable enough to withstand frontline use, and simple enough for clerks to operate under pressure. Every keystroke promised secrecy. Every glowing lamp reassured commanders that their words were safe. But that illusion of safety would prove catastrophic. For while Germany saw in Enigma the unbreakable shield of a resurgent empire, others saw a challenge, and in hidden rooms across Europe, mathematicians and cryptographers began sharpening their pencils. The battle for Enigma had begun long before the world realized it. If Enigma was a lock, its craftsmanship began with the visible parts you could touch: the keyboard, the lampboard, and the compact wooden case that housed a mechanical heart. Operators sat before it like pianists, fingers poised over keys that would translate thought into electricity, each keystroke sending current through a maze of contacts to light a letter on the lampboard. Behind the facade of lamps and type lay the rotor's cylindrical, interchangeable wheels whose internal wirings defined the machine's private wiring map. Slip a rotor into place and its 26 contacts connected distinct letters in a fixed permutation, but rotate it and the permutation shifted, a living cipher changing with each stroke. Stack 3 rotors side by side and their combined effect multiplied complexity, producing a polyalphabetic substitution that no hand could easily compute. Ahead of the rotors sat the plugboard, a seemingly simple panel where field cables paired letters in 26 tiny sockets, swapping them before and after the rotor scramble. At the far end, the reflector, an ingenious U-shaped wiring disc, sent current back through the rotating maze so that encryption became reciprocal, and a letter encrypted one way could be decrypted by running the process again. The whole assembly sat on a metal chassis designed to be rugged enough for field use, its wooden case padded against shocks, but vulnerable to the damp and grit of a frontline life. To an untrained eye, Enigma looked like a mechanical typewriter. To cryptographers it was a machine that embedded mathematics in motion, and to commanders it promised the seductive safety of sealed channels. Only later would that promise be tested against the patience of mathematicians who read its motion as pattern rather than magic. Rotors were the brain cells of Enigma, each one a fixed wiring map that permuted the alphabet into a one-to-one substitution, soldered and sealed to prevent easy inspection. Inside each rotor, 26 contacts corresponded to the familiar letters, but their internal wires connected them in scrambled order, a clandestine wiring diagram invisible without disassembly. Operators could choose from several rotor types, each given Roman numerals, whose differing wirings meant that selecting rotor IOAT produced entirely different encryption behaviors. Mounted on a spindle, each rotor could be set to one of 26 initial positions, a choice recorded in operational keys and essential to synchronization between sender and recipient. Around the rotor circumference sat the ringstellum, which allowed the alphabet relative to the turnover notch to be offset, subtly changing when a rotor would step and thereby altering the entire stepping sequence. The turnover notch was the mechanical tooth that told the rotor to advance the one to its left, creating the cascade of motion that made Enigma dynamic rather than static. It was this motion that converted a simple substitution into a complex polyalphabetic system, as each key press could change the wiring path for the next letter. But the rotors were also fragile points. Contact brushes, copper traces, and the accumulation of dust or salt spray could change electrical contact resistance, altering behavior in inscrutable ways. Maintenance crews on U-boats and at field stations spent as much time cleaning and oiling rotor contacts as their counterparts did. Polishing brass on parade grounds for a dirty contact could spell interrupted command at sea. And because the rotors were interchangeable, the very feature that allowed flexibility also provided cryptanalysts with the structured variations they would eventually learn to exploit. The plugboard, or Steckerbrett, sat at the front of German Enigmas, like a tactical chessboard of plugs and cables that dramatically multiplied possible settings. Operators connected short cables between pairs of letters, A to M, G to T, and so on, so that an input letter might be swapped before it ever reached the rotor assembly. This pre- and post-rotor substitution meant that even identical rotor wirings became effectively unique once paired with a plugboard configuration. Militaries commonly used 10 plug pairs, leaving 6 letters unmated, a setting that balanced security with practical ease of reconfiguration under combat conditions. The physical act of swapping plugs under blackout conditions, fingers fumbling in the dark, added human drama to what was otherwise a dry mechanical setting. Because the plug board affected signals both entering and leaving the rotors, its effect was multiplicative rather than additive, raising the number of plausible configurations astronomically. Yet the plugs were also operators' daily vulnerability. Misplaced chords, wear-on contacts, or reused pairings across messages could create predictable patterns for analysts to search. Commanders respected the plugboard's power so deeply that some secrecy instructions forbade discussing pairings aloud, requiring dedicated lists kept under strict guard. For an intercept analyst in a dimly lit monitoring room, the presence of a plugboard meant the difference between a solvable puzzle and a Gordian knot, unless other mistakes exposed it. In practice, the plugboard turned Enigma from a clever machine into a fortress of permutations that nonetheless depended on meticulous human discipline. The reflector, the Umkehrweise, performed a legal sleight of hand by wiring pairs of contacts together. It ensured that encryption was self-reciprocal. What encrypted could be decrypted on the same machine setting. This reciprocity simplified field operations enormously, because a unit could use one machine for both sending and receiving without changing internal wiring. The same initial settings would both encrypt and reverse messages. Yet that convenience came with a cryptographic scent of vinegar. Because of the reflector's pairing, an Enigma machine could never encrypt a letter as itself, a hard rule that left a subtle but exploitable footprint in ciphertext. For codebreakers, this impossibility of self-encipherment was not a hindrance but a clue. Crib matching could use the knowledge that plain text and ciphertext never matched at the same position to exclude false leads. Reflectors themselves came in variants, rotating models, and fixed versions, each producing slightly different reciprocal maps that altered the machine's signature. Some military branches even introduced interchangeable reflectors to complicate analysis, but these switches were finite and therefore offered only limited additional complexity. The reflector's elegance also meant the encryption process was symmetric and thus designed for operational practicality rather than mathematical invulnerability. In the hands of operators facing rainy nights on carriers or freezing decks of destroyers, that practical symmetry mattered more than theoretical perfection, for it reduced error in hectic conditions. Yet the same design choice that eased field use seeded a vulnerability that cryptanalysts would exploit with patience and pattern recognition. The reflector shows how wartime engineering balanced human needs and mathematical purity, often at the cost of long-term secrecy. Enigma's genius was not merely the rotors themselves, but how they moved, stepping after each key press to produce a constantly shifting substitution landscape. The rightmost rotor stepped with nearly every keystroke. The middle rotor advanced when the right rotor reached its turnover notch, and the leftmost rotated even more rarely, creating a complex stepping rhythm. Crucially, a mechanical quirk known as the double-stepping anomaly meant that under certain conditions the middle rotor could advance 2 steps in succession, producing non-intuitive motion patterns. This anomaly, invisible to operators and unintended by designers, produced repeating patterns in rotor positions that cryptanalysts could detect and exploit. Ring settings shifted the relation between the turnover notch and the rotor labels, allowing the same wiring to produce distinct stepping sequences and thereby altering the cipher stream. Each key press thus merged electrical permutation with mechanical choreography, a blend of gears and currents that turned a simple machine into something resembling a living organism. Operators set rotor positions and ring settings using daily key sheets, often under pressure, and any error in those settings could render a message unreadable even to the intended recipient. Mechanics and cryptanalysts later realized that the stepping behavior, especially the anomaly, yielded constraints correlations between adjacent cipher letters that their algorithms could use as footholds. The interplay of stepping and wiring demonstrated that mechanical design decisions could have profound cryptographic consequences beyond initial expectations. Thus, motion rotational timing, not merely wiring, became the most subtle and decisive element of Enigma's secrecy. From these elements, rotor order, rotor positions, ring settings, and plugboard pairings, the theoretical key space that Enigma could present was gargantuan. If an operator chose 3 rotors from a set of 5, the number of possible rotor selections alone was 5 Cote 4 Cote 3, or 60 distinct orders. Each rotor could be placed in any of 26 initial positions, giving 26 cubed, or 17,576, possible rotor position combinations for a 3-rotor machine. Ring settings, which offset the alphabet relative to the turnover notch, added another factor of 26 cubed, again 17,576 variations in how the machine would step. The plugboard, when configured with 10 paired cables, a common military practice, yielded 150,738,274,937,250 distinct pairings, a number already almost inconceivable by ordinary reckoning. Multiply these factors, 60 for rotor order, 17,576 for rotor positions, 17,576 for ring settings, and 150,278,274,937,250 for the plugboard, and the product is approximately 2,793,925,870,516,103,360,000 possible settings. Put bluntly, that astronomical figure, about 279 Cote 24, meant that trying keys at random was hopeless with the technology of the 1930s and early 1940s. Yet this theoretical immensity masked the practical constraints of human procedure, key reuse, operator habits, and the need for common message formats that made real-world cryptanalysis possible. Cryptanalysts simplified the problem by exploiting operational shortcuts, repeated keys, predictable salutations, and the finite ways humans tended to use machines under stress. Thus, while Enigma's mathematical universe dwarfed any single mind, the battlefield of signals offered human tendencies to be exploited as cracks in the armor. In the field, security lived and died by procedure, and the Allies found that the machine's complexity could be undermined by how humans used it. German operators received daily key sheets, Schlüsselheft, listing rotor order, ring settings, and plugboard pairs that would govern all communications for a 24-hour period. To send a message, a clerk would set the machine to the published daily ground setting and then encipher a randomly chosen message key, often sending that 3-letter key twice as an indicator, an early procedural habit that proved catastrophic. By encrypting the message key twice, operators inadvertently created patterns. Repeated ciphertext blocks gave cryptanalysts the symmetry they needed to peel back layers of permutation. Over time, procedures changed. The Germans introduced different indicator systems, and the Navy adopted distinct conventions, but the cataclysmic tension between operational convenience and cryptographic rigor remained constant. Operators rushed on deck in storm or exhausted after nights on watch, sometimes reused keys, inserted plugs in habitual pairings, or began messages with predictable words like "wetter" or formal salutations, habits that analysts would term cribs. A single captured codebook or a prisoner who could recall a daily setting was worth more than a dozen interrogations, for those physical artifacts collapsed the key space instantly. That interplay, the machine's brute combinatorial strength versus human procedural weakness, became the fulcrum upon which the code-breaking struggle balanced. Bletchley Park and Polish cryptanalysts paid as much attention to soap and water cleaning of rotor contacts and the wording of standard weather reports as they did to theoretical group theory. In wartime, engineering and human behavior braided together, and Enigma's security proved to be as much about discipline as design. Across the oceans and continents, Enigma's mechanical nature left fingerprints, contact resistance, worn key springs, and even the way a particular operator struck the keys could introduce subtle biases into the cipher text. In U-boats, salt spray corroded contacts and batteries sagged, producing faint voltage drops that sometimes changed lamp intensity and, more dangerously, altered signal timing in predictable ways. On land, clerks working in freezing Russian winters or muddy North African bivouacs found that dirt and humidity affected rotor contacts, which in turn meant that patterns could emerge not from mathematics, but from metal fatigue. Traffic volume was another vulnerability, for mass communications to coordinate convoys or air raids produced repeatable structures, dates, grid references, and weather reports that analysts could isolate as cribs. Tools like the British Bombe took advantage of theoretical constraints, the reflector's reciprocity, and the double-stepping anomaly to cut the key space astronomically without brute force. Captures of codebooks and machines, from the earlier seizure of a Polish Enigma to daring naval boardings that netted rotors and manuals, supplied the practical anchors cryptanalysts needed to test hypotheses. Yet Enigma's strengths should not be undersold. It was rugged, decentralized, and fast, able to sustain the tempo of mechanized warfare and underpin the German Blitzkrieg's command systems. Its combination of mechanical engineering and operational convenience changed expectations about speed and mobility in command, enabling orders to flow with a velocity never before seen. But every practical advantage contained a trade-off, and the very technologies that enabled rapid coordination also created the patterns that mathematics and patient observation would pry open. In the end, Enigma's anatomy, the rotors, plugs, reflectors, and their quirks, was both its genius and its Achilles heel, a machine whose movements wrote the story of a battle between human error and mathematical insight. When the smoke of the First World War cleared, Germany was a nation bound by treaties yet restless with ambition. The Treaty of Versailles had clipped its military wings, limiting the size of the Reichswehr and forbidding rearmament, but it had not extinguished the will to rebuild. In secret staff meetings, German officers searched for tools that could give them an edge without violating the treaty's letter. One of those tools was secure communication, a battlefield weapon invisible to inspectors yet vital to strategy. Messages in the last war had been intercepted with alarming ease, and no modern army could afford to have its orders read aloud in enemy headquarters. It was here, in the twilight between defeat and renewal, that Enigma found its military calling. The Reichswehr recognized at once that the machine's portability, speed, and apparent invulnerability matched its urgent needs. While tanks and aircraft were still restricted, a cipher machine could be adopted under the guise of commercial use. And so, quietly, Enigma was invited into the heart of Germany's reawakening military machine. The earliest adoptions occurred in the mid-1920s, when the Reichswehr purchased commercial Enigma machines in modest numbers. These models, still close to Arthur Scherbius's original design, had 3 rotors and no plugboard, but their complexity already exceeded any manual cipher then in use. Officers tested the machines during exercises, using them to coordinate maneuvers across units spread over miles of countryside. Field trials confirmed their potential. Messages could be encrypted and decrypted quickly, even under stress, and mistakes were rare compared to cumbersome codebooks. Reports emphasized the machine's resilience. Wooden cases carried in trucks or horse-drawn carts withstood the rigors of travel. By 1926, German staff officers recommended formal integration of Enigma into command networks. Procurement began under the camouflage of civilian agencies to avoid Allied suspicion. To outsiders, these were machines purchased for railways, banks, or shipping firms, but inside the Reichswehr they became the pulse of hidden command. And with each passing year, the military began shaping Enigma into something sharper, stronger, and uniquely German. The turning point came when the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, recognized the machine's potential for sea power. Naval strategy depended on wireless communication, and during the First World War, British intelligence had broken German codes with disastrous consequences. To ensure this never happened again, the Navy demanded modifications that would elevate Enigma's security beyond the reach of foreign cryptographers. Engineers responded by adding the plugboard, or Steckerbrett, which multiplied the number of possible settings to astronomical proportions. The Navy also insisted on strict procedures for daily key changes, rigorous operator training, and an additional layer of secrecy around distribution. These changes transformed Enigma from a clever commercial tool into a military-grade weapon of secrecy. By the late 1920s, the Navy had fully adopted Enigma as its standard cipher device, deploying it across fleets and shore commands. Officers trusted it to secure orders for U-boats and capital ships, confident that no outsider could pierce its shifting labyrinth. And the Kriegsmarine's version became the model upon which the Army would soon build its own. The German Army, following the Navy's lead, began adopting Enigma in earnest by the early 1930s. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, rearmament accelerated, and with it came the need for secure, rapid communication across a growing war machine. The Army's version of Enigma featured the now standard 3 rotors and plugboard, but introduced its own operational procedures. Daily key sheets specified rotor order, ring settings, and plugboard pairings. Distributed in sealed packets to units across Germany, soldiers drilled in their use until even under battlefield stress, messages could be enciphered and transmitted in minutes. The Reichswehr transformed into the Wehrmacht, and with that transformation, Enigma became its voice. Generals relied on the machine to transmit orders to divisions, massing for exercises that defied Versailles, each keystroke a quiet defiance of the treaty. By mid-decade, Enigma was so integrated into military life that commanders could scarcely imagine operations without it. And as Germany's armies swelled, so too did their reliance on the cipher that promised invulnerability. The Luftwaffe, formed in violation of Versailles, soon adopted Enigma as well. Air operations demanded lightning coordination. Squadrons scrambled, bombing raids redirected, and reconnaissance flights recalled, all through wireless orders vulnerable to interception. Enigma provided the shield for this new arm of war, ensuring that German air power could act with speed and precision. Messages sent from command centers in Berlin could reach pilots in minutes, transformed into ciphertext that seemed like nonsense to any eavesdropper. To the Allies watching nervously from across borders, the scale of German rearmament was clear, but the invisible web of secure communication remained hidden. The Luftwaffe's adoption of Enigma completed the triad Army, Navy, and Air Force, each using the machine as their standard cipher. By the mid-1930s, Germany had created a unified cryptographic infrastructure, unseen yet critical to the blitzkrieg to come. Secure communication was no longer a luxury, but the backbone of a modern mechanized military, and Enigma was the iron sinew binding it all together. To increase security further, the German military introduced additional rotors, expanding the possible configurations. Initially 3, the Wehrmacht soon developed a set of 5, from which operators selected 3 for daily use, raising the permutations dramatically. Later, the Kriegsmarine went further still, introducing machines with a 4th rotor for Atlantic U-boats, making their cipher vastly more complex. These modifications were accompanied by rigorous training and strict discipline, with punishments for operators who failed to follow procedure. Enigma machines were treated as weapons, to be guarded with the same vigilance as rifles or artillery. Operators carried pistols with standing orders to destroy the device or commit suicide rather than allow capture. On ships, weighted bags were prepared to throw machines overboard if boarding seemed imminent. Every detail underscored the belief that Enigma was invulnerable and must remain so at any cost. And this culture of secrecy only deepened Germany's confidence in the machine. By 1939, on the eve of war, Enigma was fully embedded in every level of German command, from Berlin headquarters to U-boat wolf packs, prowling the Atlantic from panzer divisions, rolling across Poland to Luftwaffe wings over the Reich. Enigma's lamps flickered with orders that shaped the world's fate. The machine had become so ubiquitous that the German war effort depended on it as much as on tanks and aircraft. To intercept an order without breaking it was to capture only silence. To break it was to strip Germany of its cloak of invisibility. Confident in its complexity, the Wehrmacht regarded Enigma as unbreakable, a fortress of secrecy guarded by trillions of possible keys. Officers believed they had solved the age-old vulnerability of war, the fragility of communication. But even as they celebrated, mathematicians abroad were sharpening their tools. The Poles in particular had already begun to probe the fortress, testing its walls with brilliant persistence. Germany trusted the machine as if it were divine, but in that trust lay the seed of future disaster. The adoption of Enigma by the Reichswehr, and later the Wehrmacht, was more than a technical choice. It was a philosophical commitment. It represented the belief that technology could secure empire, that machines could shield secrets from human fallibility. Enigma was woven into the mythology of German rearmament, a symbol of modernity in a nation determined to erase humiliation. Each keystroke became a declaration that Germany would never again be undone by intercepted words. But this belief blinded commanders to the realities of mathematics, procedure, and human error. The machine was formidable, but it was not invulnerable. Its strength was real, but so too were its weaknesses, hidden in quirks of design and in the predictable habits of its operators. Germany had built its war machine upon Enigma, confident it had found perfection. Yet perfection in war is a dangerous illusion, and as the storm of conflict gathered, that illusion would soon be tested to breaking point. In the heart of Warsaw during the late 1920s, as Europe drifted uneasily between wars, a small group of mathematicians began a secret struggle against Germany's new weapon of secrecy. Poland, sandwiched precariously between two rising powers, Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east, understood that survival would depend on foreknowledge. The Big Euro Seefruv, or Cipher Bureau, was tasked with guarding Poland's communications and probing the ciphers of its neighbors. Intelligence reports confirmed that the German military had standardized a machine called Enigma, a device that seemed invulnerable to traditional cryptanalysis. For most cryptographers of the era, the machine's billions of combinations placed it beyond human reach. But the Polish Cipher Bureau did not see impossibility. They saw a challenge that could be met with mathematics rather than brute force. They recruited some of their brightest minds from Poznan University, where young mathematicians had shown rare skill in the language of permutations and group theory. These men, still in their 20s, were not career soldiers but scholars with chalk-stained hands and sharp, restless intellects. Among them was Marian Rejewski, whose genius would soon alter the course of history. And in quiet rooms in Warsaw, the first cracks in Enigma's armor began to form. Rejewski's entry into cryptanalysis was as unlikely as it was decisive. Born in 1905, he studied mathematics at Poznan, where the Cipher Bureau discreetly tested students for aptitude in secret service work. He possessed an uncanny ability to visualize abstract structures, to see patterns where others saw only chaos. When assigned to study German codes, Rejewski approached the task not as a linguist or clerk, but as a mathematician seeking order in disorder. Enigma's complexity seemed overwhelming. 3 rotors, each with 26 positions, stepping with every keystroke, and a plug board that added unfathomable depth. Yet Rejewski noticed something few others had considered. The machine, though complex, was deterministic. Every input produced an output according to precise mechanical rules, and that meant mathematics could, in theory, describe its behavior. Using group theory, a branch of abstract algebra, he began mapping the permutations created by Enigma's wiring. What emerged was not a jumble, but a structure, a set of patterns that could be exploited. In this marriage of theory and practice lay the birth of modern cryptanalysis, and Rejewski stood at its forefront. The Cipher Bureau provided Rejewski with intercepted German traffic, streams of encrypted messages that filled pages with nonsense. Each message carried an indicator, the operator's chosen rotor starting positions, enciphered twice as procedure dictated. These repeated sequences, overlooked by German designers, gave Rejewski the foothold he needed. By comparing the pairs of repeated indicators, he constructed mathematical equations that revealed relationships between rotor wirings. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to deduce the structure of the rotors themselves, cracking open what had seemed a sealed box. To aid his work, the Bureau provided a commercial enigma purchased through intermediaries, allowing him to test his hypotheses on a real machine. But the military enigma had additional complexities, especially the plug board, which seemed to multiply possibilities beyond reason. Yet Rejewski's equations cut through the fog, stripping away the illusion of infinite variation to reveal a manageable pattern beneath. It was a triumph not of chance but of logic, proof that even the most complex cipher could be bent to human intellect, and it marked the beginning of an intellectual battle that would span the globe. Rejewski was not alone in this struggle. Beside him stood Jerzy Rojicki and Henryk Zygalski, fellow mathematicians from Poznan. Rojicki brought creativity and intuition, often approaching problems from unconventional angles that startled even Rejewski. Zygalski was methodical, patient, and precise, with a talent for reducing complex systems into simpler solvable components. Together, the trio formed a unit unlike any other in Europe, blending theory, experimentation, and intuition in equal measure. Their methods diverged from the traditional linguistic approaches favored by other intelligence agencies, where British and French cryptographers often relied on language habits and educated guesses. The Poles wielded algebra, permutations, and combinatorial logic. They built diagrams, calculated cycles, and constructed chains of reasoning that mapped directly onto the machine's operations. Theirs was not guesswork, but science precise and systematic. In this fusion of mathematics and espionage, the Poles pioneered a new way of thinking about codebreaking. And it was this method that would eventually unlock the secrets of Enigma. By 1932, Rijewski achieved a breakthrough of extraordinary significance: the deduction of the internal wiring of Enigma's rotors. With only intercepted traffic and mathematical deduction, he recreated the invisible pathways inside the machine's disks. It was as if he had taken apart the rotors themselves, though they remained locked in German hands. To verify his conclusions, he constructed equations that predicted output for specific rotor positions, then tested them against intercepted messages. The results matched, confirming that his abstract algebra had pierced the machine's core. With this knowledge, the Poles could now simulate Enigma's operations, given enough traffic and time. But simulating by hand was slow and laborious, requiring endless hours of calculation. To accelerate the process, the Bureau designed mechanical aids devices that could automate part of the search for settings. It was a decisive leap forward, transforming cryptanalysis from pen and paper toil into machine-assisted science, and it placed Poland at the cutting edge of intelligence in Europe. One of the most ingenious tools was the Bombe cryptologiczna, or cryptologic bomb, devised in 1938. This machine, built by the Poles, exploited the repetition of message keys in German procedures. Each bomb contained a set of 6 interconnected Enigma equivalents, wired to cycle through possible rotor positions automatically. When fed intercepted traffic, the bomb could test thousands of configurations in hours rather than weeks. It was an audacious blend of engineering and mathematics, a precursor to the later British bombs of Bletchley Park. Alongside the bombs, Zygalski created perforated sheets, thin grids of paper with holes punched according to rotor behavior, that allowed analysts to align sheets and reveal hidden patterns. These Zygalski sheets, though fragile and manual, offered another weapon against the machine. Together, the bombs and sheets gave the Poles the means to reduce Enigma's daunting complexity to solvable proportions. It was a quiet revolution in intelligence, unfolding not on battlefields but in silent offices in Warsaw, and for a brief critical moment, Poland stood ahead of the world in the war of machines and minds. Yet success carried with it the shadow of danger, for the Germans were not standing still. In 1938, the Wehrmacht increased Enigma's complexity by adding 2 more rotors to the set, expanding the possible combinations dramatically. The procedure for enciphering indicators was also changed, eliminating the repeated keys that had been the foundation of Polish attacks. Suddenly, the carefully built Polish methods began to falter against the new security measures. The bombs that once tested thousands of settings now faced millions, an expansion beyond their capacity. The Zygalski sheets multiplied in number, demanding enormous effort to prepare and maintain. The Cipher Bureau realized that their lone struggle against Enigma was reaching its limits. Poland's resources, financial, industrial, and human, were too thin to keep pace with a machine designed by a resurgent empire. What had once been a race they led was now slipping from their grasp, and the shadow of war made their situation ever more urgent. By the summer of 1939, as German troops massed on Poland's borders, the Cipher Bureau made a fateful decision. Knowing that war was imminent, and their secrets might soon be lost, they chose to share their breakthroughs with Britain and France. In a quiet meeting near Warsaw, Polish cryptographers revealed to their stunned allies that Enigma had already been solved, at least in part. They handed over replicas of Enigma machines, diagrams of rotor wirings, and instructions for using bombs and Zygalski sheets. For the British and French, it was as though a locked door had been opened, granting them a glimpse into the German war machine. The Poles, humble yet determined, explained that they could no longer continue alone. Their gift was both a final act of defiance and a desperate plea for continuation. Weeks later, Germany invaded Poland, and the Cipher Bureau's members scattered to avoid capture. But their legacy survived in the hands of their allies, and from their sacrifice began the next chapter of the Enigma story, a chapter that would soon unfold at Bletchley Park. In the quiet offices of Warsaw's Cipher Bureau, a revolution in intelligence was unfolding long before the first German tanks rolled into Poland. Three mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różewski, and Henryk Zygalski, were at the center of this hidden battle. They were young, scarcely past university, yet possessed the intellectual firepower to challenge the most advanced cipher machine of its time. Rejewski, methodical and logical, was the architect of equations that mapped Enigma's inner workings with algebraic precision. Różewski, creative and intuitive, often leapt ahead with daring conjectures that opened unexpected pathways forward. Zygalski, patient and disciplined, ground through complex calculations that others might abandon, ensuring that no detail was left unchecked. Together they formed a trio whose unity of talent would rival any weapons project of the era. Their tools were not guns or bombs, but pencils, chalkboards, and sheer intellectual stamina. Yet the impact of their work would ripple across every battlefield of Europe. And it began with an idea as simple as it was revolutionary: to treat Enigma as mathematics in motion. Rejewski's great insight came when he realized that Enigma's permutations could be described using group theory, a branch of abstract algebra. To most cryptographers of the era, mathematics was a supporting tool, secondary to intuition and linguistic analysis. But Rejewski elevated it to the main weapon, framing Enigma's scrambled outputs as elements of mathematical cycles. Each repeated indicator, sent twice at the start of German messages, offered data points that could be mapped and compared. By compiling thousands of intercepted indicators, he built systems of equations that exposed the internal wiring of the rotors. What had seemed an impenetrable secret was now, in Rejewski's hands, a solvable puzzle. He reconstructed the wirings of the first three rotors without ever having touched a German military enigma. It was an act of pure deduction, as if he had dismantled the machine with algebra alone. This breakthrough transformed the Polish effort from guesswork into engineering, and it showed for the first time that Enigma was not invincible. Yet knowing rotor wirings was only the first step. Practical decryption required tools to handle the sheer volume of daily traffic. The Germans changed their settings every 24 hours, forcing cryptanalysts to begin anew each morning. To keep pace, the Poles needed machinery of their own, devices that could simulate Enigma at scale and test thousands of possibilities rapidly. In 1938, Rejewski designed the Bombe cryptologic SNR, a machine that replicated 6 enigmas wired together in a precise configuration. Each bomb cycled through rotor positions, searching for contradictions that would eliminate impossible settings. When a match emerged, the bomb pointed analysts toward the correct daily key. It was a mechanical counterpunch to the German fortress of secrecy, built with Polish ingenuity and constructed by the AVA Radio Manufacturing Company in Warsaw. 6 bombs were completed, each named after the ticking sound of its relays. With them, the Cipher Bureau could pierce Enigma daily, turning theory into practice. It was the world's first purpose-built cryptanalytic machine, and it carried the unmistakable fingerprint of Rejewski's genius. Jerzy Różewski contributed another critical innovation, the cyclometer. This device catalogued the cycle lengths of Enigma permutations, creating a vast reference book that mapped patterns in rotor behavior. The cyclometer was less glamorous than the bomb, but equally essential, for it allowed analysts to predict how Enigma would behave under certain conditions. By building this catalogue, Różewski reduced the randomness of German encryption into predictable, charted cycles. His contribution saved analysts countless hours of blind searching, streamlining the process of narrowing down possible settings. Rozhitsky's creative mind saw connections others missed, linking mathematical abstractions with practical cryptanalysis. Tragically, his life was cut short in 1942 when the ship Lamoureux carrying him across the Mediterranean sank under mysterious circumstances. Yet his early work ensured that Enigma could be attacked systematically rather than chaotically. His fingerprints remained on every decrypted German message, even long after his untimely death, and his brilliance made him an irreplaceable member of the Polish trio. Henryk Zygalski, quiet and meticulous, gave the Bureau another weapon, the perforated sheets that bore his name. Each Zygalski sheet was a thin piece of card, punched with holes representing possible rotor alignments for particular settings. When analysts overlaid multiple sheets, only the correct alignment would allow light to pass through consistently, revealing the hidden daily key. It was a labor-intensive method, requiring 66 sheets to cover all rotor combinations, each painstakingly prepared by hand. Yet the system worked, providing a manual fallback even when bombs faltered against new German modifications. Zygalski's sheets were fragile, easily damaged by mishandling or weather, but they were also portable, a crucial advantage for a bureau under constant threat. When war approached, the Poles produced complete sets for their British and French allies, handing them over in July 1939. These sheets, simple in design, yet brilliant in concept, became part of the Allied toolkit for breaking Enigma. Zygalski's contribution showed that even in an age of machines, human patience and ingenuity still mattered. And in his sheets lay the bridge between Poland's solitary struggle and the coming joint effort of Europe. By 1938, the Cipher Bureau had achieved something astonishing: regular, reliable decryption of German military traffic. For years the Poles read Wehrmacht orders, gaining insight into troop movements, logistics, and planning. This intelligence gave Poland a fragile but real window into German intentions, though political leaders often underestimated its importance. The triumph was kept secret even from most of the Polish military, hidden behind layers of compartmentalization. For Rejewski, Rozhitsky, and Zygalski, the work was exhausting but exhilarating, each breakthrough proof that intellect could level the field against a stronger foe. Yet their success was fragile, dependent on procedural errors in German usage, and limited by the resources of a small nation. The bombs and sheets gave them speed, but not enough to guarantee dominance once the Germans made further changes. The looming expansion of rotor sets threatened to undo years of work in an instant. And with war clouds thickening, the Poles knew they would soon be fighting not just with ciphers but with soldiers. The breakthrough's greatest test came with the changes Germany introduced in late 1938. The addition of 2 new rotors, bringing the set to 5, expanded the search space to levels that strained Polish resources. The bombs could no longer process the flood of possibilities within a single day. The Zygalski sheets multiplied in number, demanding impossible labor to complete in time. Yet the Poles refused to surrender their progress, continuing to innovate even as the odds tilted against them. They worked nights, feverishly updating sheets, adjusting bombs, and recalculating cycle tables. In their minds, time itself was the enemy, time before the Germans struck, and time before their methods collapsed under new complexity. Still, they managed to keep up, decrypting enough traffic to maintain a tenuous grip on German communications. But they knew the storm was coming, and when it arrived in September 1939, Poland would be forced to make one final, desperate choice. In July 1939, with war only weeks away, the Cipher Bureau invited British and French intelligence officers to a secret meeting near Warsaw. There, in a small villa, the Poles revealed the full extent of their achievements. To the astonishment of their allies, they produced working Enigma replicas, rotor wirings, Zagulski sheets, and bomb designs. The British, who had struggled for years without progress, suddenly realized that the Poles had been years ahead all along. It was a transfer of knowledge as dramatic as any battlefield alliance, a gift born of desperation but also of faith. Poland would soon be overrun, but their legacy would live on through their allies. The trio's work gave Bletchley Park a head start, without which the later victories of Ultra would have been impossible. Rogowski, Rozicki, and Zagulski faded into obscurity for decades, their contributions overshadowed by the more famous British story. But history has since restored their rightful place, for it was in Warsaw, years before Bletchley, that Enigma first cracked open. In September 1939, the storm that Poland had long feared finally broke with full and merciless force. German panzer divisions surged across the western border on September 1st, their radios alive with orders carried by the Enigma machine. Luftwaffe bombers darkened the skies over Warsaw, their precision strikes crippling airfields and rail junctions. The Polish army, brave but outnumbered, found itself fighting on multiple fronts with weapons often decades old. Just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union struck from the east, fulfilling the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Poland was carved apart by two ruthless powers, its independence smothered in a matter of weeks. Amid the chaos, the Cipher Bureau faced an urgent dilemma. The secrets of Enigma, years in the making, could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Their bombs, sheets, and precious documents were suddenly more valuable than gold, for they held the key to the German war machine. Destruction seemed the safest course, yet salvation demanded that the knowledge live on, and so began one of the most daring intellectual escapes of the Second World War. The Cipher Bureau had prepared for this moment, though no plan could account for the speed of disaster. In late August, as German troops massed on the border, vital equipment was quietly dismantled. The replica Enigma machines constructed in Warsaw were packed into crates, disguised as mundane cargo. Zagulski sheets were bundled in sealed folders, each carefully labeled to ensure their survival beyond Poland's borders. Rogowski and his colleagues carried equations and wirings in their minds, prepared to reconstruct lost tools if necessary. Burning pits consumed the most sensitive papers, so that nothing useful could be captured by advancing Germans. Cipher Bureau officers scattered to safe houses, coordinating under conditions of secrecy and panic. Families were left behind, unknowing, while husbands and fathers disappeared into the chaos. Their mission was no longer only mathematical, it had become a race for survival. Every intercepted message, every page of notes, every machine was now a national treasure that could decide the fate of Europe, and the men of the Bureau were determined that treasure would not be lost. The Polish plan of escape hinged on reaching France, where the Allies might continue the work begun in Warsaw. Smuggling routes snaked through Romania, chosen because its government was still neutral and offered a potential corridor to the west. In small groups, cryptographers disguised themselves as civilians, carrying false papers and avoiding checkpoints manned by suspicious guards. At border crossings, crates of equipment were hidden beneath innocuous loads, furniture, tools, or even agricultural goods. Some couriers carried nothing but memory, relying on the knowledge etched into their minds. For Rogowski, Rozicki, and Zagulski, every movement across the countryside was fraught with danger. German patrols swept roads and rail lines, while Soviet troops hunted those fleeing east. Yet the Cipher Bureau's men pressed on, knowing that if they failed, their years of labor would vanish into the fires of occupation. This was not a sprint, but a desperate marathon across shattered Europe, and behind them, Warsaw burned. The journey was not without betrayal and peril. In some towns, locals sympathetic to the Germans denounced fleeing officials, forcing cryptographers to move by night. Others found kindness among strangers, receiving food and shelter from peasants who knew nothing of Enigma but sensed the importance of their burden. In Romania, the Polish escapes found temporary refuge, aided by diplomats who helped arrange passage onward. From there, couriers carried documents to Paris, while men of the Cipher Bureau followed along separate routes. Zygalski sheets, delicate and irreplaceable, were handled with reverence, each set representing months of labor. The bombs too large to move intact were left behind, though designs survived in the minds of their creators. German intelligence knew nothing of the scale of what had slipped through their grasp. To the occupiers, Poland's resistance seemed crushed. To the Allies, an invisible treasure had just arrived, and with it came the first true hope of cracking the German codes. When the Polish cryptographers reached France, they found themselves in a world already bracing for German conquest. Paris in late 1939 was alive with rumors, soldiers drilling, and governments preparing for the inevitable clash. Yet beneath the surface, intelligence services buzzed with excitement over the Poles' arrival. At the Château de Vignoles near Paris, the Bureau shared their secrets with astonished French and British officers. Out came the replica Enigma, the wiring diagrams, and the painstakingly prepared Zygalski sheets. Rejewski calmly explained how algebra had reconstructed rotors, while Rojicki demonstrated the cyclometer method. Zygalski unfurled his perforated sheets, showing how overlapping patterns could reveal daily keys. The Allies, long stymied by Enigma, now realized that Poland had been years ahead of them. For the first time, the fortress of German communication no longer seemed impregnable, and the foundation of what would become ultra was laid in that French villa. Yet, even in France, safety proved fleeting. When Germany launched its Blitzkrieg in May 1940, French defences crumbled much as Poland's had months earlier. Once again, the Polish cryptographers were forced to flee, carrying their secrets into the unknown. This time, their path took them south into unoccupied Vichy territory, then across the Pyrenees into Spain. The trek was harrowing. Arrests by Spanish authorities, prison cells, and near starvation haunted the cryptographers. Diplomatic intervention secured their release, and eventually they reached neutral Portugal. From Lisbon they sailed to Britain, a battered island now standing alone against Hitler's empire. Here the final stage of their odyssey ended at Bletchley Park, where their knowledge would ignite a new chapter in the code-breaking war. But for the Poles themselves, recognition would remain elusive for decades. They were heroes without parades, shadows behind the spotlight, and yet without them, Bletchley would have begun in darkness. For Rejewski, Rojicki, and Zygalski, exile was bittersweet. They had saved their work and handed it to allies, but their homeland lay crushed beneath German and Soviet boots. Families were scattered, some lost forever, while Poland itself was erased from the map. In Britain, they worked alongside cryptanalysts, contributing quietly while others took the lead. Their early breakthroughs had bought the Allies precious years of advantage, yet wartime secrecy ensured their names were barely known. Rojicki would not live to see victory, his life cut short in the sinking of the Lamrol in 1942. Rejewski and Zygalski endured, but in obscurity their wartime service classified long after the guns fell silent. Their story became one of sacrifice, brilliance, and anonymity, a tale hidden beneath the grand narrative of Bletchley Park. Yet the truth endured in the decrypts that flowed to Allied commanders, and in every intercepted order, one could hear the echo of Warsaw's mathematicians. The fall of Poland was a national tragedy, but from its ashes came a gift that altered the trajectory of the war. The knowledge smuggled out under fire provided the Allies with the keys to begin unraveling Enigma. Without it, British and French cryptographers might have spent years floundering precious time that the Wehrmacht would have used to consolidate victory. Instead, the foundation was laid before the war even reached its full fury. The escape of knowledge was as critical as any battle fought on land, sea, or air. It was a triumph of courage, intellect, and foresight in the face of overwhelming disaster. Poland may have been crushed militarily, but intellectually it had struck a blow against Germany's sense of invulnerability. The torch had been passed, carried across borders and into the hands of new allies. In the end, the Cipher Bureau's legacy did not perish in the flames of 1939. Instead, it lit the path that would one day lead to ultras Normandy and victory. In the late 1930s, as Europe stumbled toward war, Britain faced a daunting reality. German rearmament was accelerating, and the Enigma machine stood as the Empire's invisible shield. The British government, remembering the intelligence successes of Room 40 during the First World War, knew that signals intelligence would again be decisive. But this time, the task was more daunting, for Enigma was not a codebook to be stolen, but a machine of dizzying permutations. To meet this challenge, the British Secret Intelligence Service and the Government Code and Cipher School sought a headquarters for their effort. They found it in a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, a country estate with sprawling grounds, far from the Luftwaffe's immediate reach. Its name was Bletchley Park, a place destined to become synonymous with the Secret War. The estate was modest at first glance, but its location near both Oxford and Cambridge made it ideal for recruiting the brightest minds in Britain. The railway junction nearby allowed quick access to London, yet provided a shield of relative seclusion. Here Britain's code-breaking army would be forged, and here the Allies' silent war against Enigma would find its beating heart. The choice of Bletchley was as pragmatic as it was symbolic. The mansion itself, with its mock Tudor facade and eccentric design, concealed a sprawling complex of huts and outbuildings hastily erected as the war intensified. At first, only a few dozen people occupied the estate, a strange mix of linguists, mathematicians, classicists, and crossword enthusiasts. Many were dons from Oxford and Cambridge, summoned by discreet letters hinting at government service of the utmost importance. Others were eccentric geniuses, plucked from obscurity for their raw talent at puzzles and lateral thinking. Women recruited in unprecedented numbers formed the backbone of clerical and analytical work, their patience and precision critical to the daily grind of decryption. The atmosphere combined the urgency of wartime with the eccentricity of academia, where professors argued over Greek verse one moment and rota permutations the next. As the war deepened, the population of Bletchley Park swelled from dozens to thousands. Its huts, once temporary, became humming factories of intelligence, and the peculiar mansion became the nerve center of an empire's most secret weapon. The recruitment process was as unconventional as the people it attracted. Britain's War Office, recognizing that traditional military officers were ill-suited for the abstract battle against Enigma, looked to universities for fresh talent. In 1939, the Daily Telegraph even hosted a crossword competition, quietly identifying individuals with extraordinary pattern recognition skills. Successful solvers were invited to join the hush-hush world of Bletchley Park, where their hobbies became instruments of war. Mathematicians like Gordon Welchman and Alan Turing brought new dimensions of abstract logic to the fight, transforming cryptanalysis into a science of machines and probability. Linguists unraveled intercepted messages, not only in German but also in Italian and Japanese, broadening the reach of Allied intelligence. Clergymen, schoolteachers, and even chess champions found themselves working side by side, their diverse talents fused by a single goal. No other military unit in history had looked quite like this one, where tweed jackets, teacups, and chalkboards formed the tools of battle. What bound them together was not uniformity but brilliance, and brilliance was exactly what the war required. Among these recruits, Alan Turing quickly became one of the most influential figures in the entire operation. A mathematician with an eccentric manner and an unrivaled capacity for abstract reasoning, Turing brought clarity to the labyrinth of Enigma's permutations. His brilliance lay not in doing what the Poles had already done, but in envisioning a mechanized solution to scale their achievements. Turing's mind grasped the weaknesses inherent in German operating procedures, and he designed a machine, the Bombe, that could exploit them systematically. His ideas were as radical as they were practical, transforming cryptanalysis from a slow manual craft into an industrialized science. Yet Turing was not alone. Gordon Welchman refined his designs by introducing the diagonal board, a modification that dramatically increased efficiency. The synergy between theory and engineering turned Bletchley Park into a factory of ideas, where mechanical relays hummed as soldiers of a new invisible front. Turing's quiet eccentricities, his bicycle rides, his obsession with cryptic problems, his difficulty with social conventions only added to his legend. But behind the myths was a man who gave the Allies their sharpest weapon, and at Bletchley Park that weapon would be sharpened daily. Life at Bletchley Park was a curious blend of monotony and brilliance, secrecy and camaraderie. Workers lived in cold, drafty huts, often hunched over typewriters, or listening to endless streams of Morse code. The sound of machines filled the air, punctuated by the tapping of teleprinters and the scratching of pens. Intercepted German traffic arrived constantly, intercepted by Y stations across Britain and ferried to Bletchley for decryption. Each scrap of ciphertext represented a potential clue, a thread to be unraveled with patience and precision. Shifts ran around the clock, for the Germans changed Enigma keys daily, and failure to solve them by midnight meant valuable intelligence was lost forever. Yet, amid the exhaustion, a spirit of purpose bound the workers together, a sense that they were shaping the fate of nations. Friendships blossomed in the cramped huts, romances kindled over cups of weak tea, and the shared burden of secrecy forged bonds stronger than steel. None could speak of their work outside, not even to their families. But within the fences of Bletchley, they knew they were part of something extraordinary. The secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park was absolute, enforced by the Official Secrets Act, with penalties that loomed over every conversation. Workers were instructed never to discuss their tasks, even with colleagues in other huts. A cryptographer might spend years working on a single aspect of Enigma without ever knowing the larger picture. This compartmentalization kept the system secure, but also created an atmosphere of mystery within the park itself. At dances or social gatherings in the mansion, young women and men mingled, all bound by secrets they could not share. Only after the war would many discover that their closest friends had been working on entirely different sections of the same colossal puzzle. The silence extended beyond the gates. Families received vague explanations about clerical work or administrative duties. Even decades later, veterans of Bletchley struggled to break the habit of secrecy. Yet this cloak of silence was part of its strength, ensuring that German intelligence never suspected the scale of the British effort, and it allowed Bletchley to wage its hidden war in the shadows. As the war expanded, so too did Bletchley's mission. By 1942, the park housed thousands of workers, including Wrens of the Women's Royal Naval Service, who operated Bombe's in remote outstations. The work extended beyond Enigma to Japanese naval codes and Italian military ciphers, making Bletchley a global intelligence hub. The park's organization evolved into specialized sections, each tackling a particular problem. Hut 6 for Army and Air Force Enigma, Hut 8 for Naval Enigma, Hut 3 for Analysis and Dissemination. These huts became legendary in their own right, centers of innovation where breakthroughs rippled outward to the battlefield. Intelligence decrypted at Bletchley was code-named Ultra, and it would influence campaigns from the Battle of the Atlantic to D-Day. Commanders received information so precise it seemed as though they had spies inside German headquarters. But few knew the truth that it came from a quiet estate in Buckinghamshire, from minds armed with mathematics and machines. And as Ultra grew, so too did the legend of Bletchley Park. The creation of Bletchley Park was more than the establishment of a code-breaking center. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare. Here intellect replaced firepower, and battles were fought with pencils, equations, and machines of whirring relays. It was a war where victory depended on timing, precision, and the relentless pursuit of hidden patterns. The mansion in Buckinghamshire became a crucible where the brightest minds of a generation bent their skills to the struggle for survival. Their work would save convoys from U-boats, reveal enemy troop movements, and give Allied commanders an advantage unlike any in history. Yet the workers themselves remained unsung, their contributions cloaked in secrecy for decades. What began with Polish breakthroughs and desperate escapes now blossomed into a British institution of global consequence. The Allies had found their citadel of intelligence, their fortress of logic and innovation, and Bletchley Park would prove that wars are not won by weapons alone. They are also won by minds that refuse to surrender. In September 1939, as Britain declared war on Germany, a quiet young mathematician cycled through the gates of Bletchley Park. His name was Alan Turing, and though unassuming in appearance, his mind held the power to change the course of the war. At Cambridge, Turing had already distinguished himself as a genius of abstract thought, his work on computability laying the foundation for what the world would later call computer science. To colleagues he seemed eccentric, often absent-minded, with habits that baffled those around him. He chained his tea mug to a radiator to prevent theft, rode his bicycle with a gas mask to fight hay fever, and preferred to speak through equations rather than small talk. But behind his quirks lay a capacity for logical clarity unmatched in his generation. Where others saw Enigma as overwhelming complexity, Turing saw it as structure waiting to be dissected. His arrival at Bletchley Park marked the beginning of a new phase in the cryptographic war, and it was here, amid huts and chalkboards, that his genius would find its battlefield. Turing was assigned to Hut 8, the section dedicated to Naval Enigma, by far the most difficult variant. The German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, used additional rotors, stricter procedures, and greater discipline than their Army or Air Force counterparts. Messages carried by U-boats prowling the Atlantic were among the most valuable of all, for they threatened Britain's lifeline of convoys. Yet they were also the most resistant to decryption, frustrating analysts who labored day after day with little progress. Turing approached the problem not as a linguist, but as a logician, asking how machines might be used to simulate and test vast numbers of possibilities. He recognized that the Polish innovations, brilliant though they were, could not scale to the new demands of war. The Germans' daily changes and naval complexity required something faster, more systematic, and mechanical. Turing envisioned a machine that could eliminate impossible settings en masse, narrowing the search space to manageable proportions. It was an idea both radical and practical, and it would become the cornerstone of Bletchley Park's assault on Enigma. The heart of Turing's approach lay in the concept of the crib, a guessed piece of plain text within a ciphertext message. Germans often used predictable phrases, weather reports, formal greetings, or routine operational terms that could serve as anchors for decryption. By aligning a guessed plaintext with ciphertext, Turing saw that contradictions could be exposed, eliminating vast numbers of rotor and plugboard settings. But checking these possibilities by hand was impossibly slow, requiring millions of calculations each day. The Polish Bombe had mechanized part of this search, but its design was tied to older procedures that the Germans had already abandoned. Turing conceived of a new kind of machine, more flexible and more powerful, capable of running logical tests at scale. His concept transformed codebreaking into an industrial process, where electrical relays would perform what human brains and pencils could not. The machine would not guess the key directly, but instead filter the haystack until only the needle remained. It was a fusion of mathematics and engineering, and it would soon be called the Bombe. Turing's personality shaped his work as much as his mathematics did. He was famously difficult in conversation, often lapsing into silence or speaking with blunt honesty that startled his colleagues. Yet his mind moved with dazzling speed, leaping from problem to solution in ways that seemed magical to those around him. He disliked bureaucracy and authority, preferring to work alone or with a small circle of trusted collaborators. His appearance was disheveled, his manner eccentric, but his colleagues quickly learned to overlook these traits in awe of his brilliance. He could hold entire chains of logic in his head, testing permutations and discarding impossibilities with effortless clarity. When others flagged under the weight of endless ciphertext, Turing found energy in the challenge itself. His genius was not loud but relentless, a steady force that bent complexity to order. At Bletchley, where eccentricity was almost the rule, Turing still stood out as unique, and yet his uniqueness proved to be exactly what the war required. To transform Turing's ideas into reality required collaboration, for mathematics alone could not build machines. Engineers at the British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth were brought into the secret, led by Harold Dox Keene. Working from Turing's specifications, they began designing a machine that could run logical chains of tests across thousands of rotor positions. The machine was enormous, standing taller than a man, its banks of rotating drums simulating Enigma rotors at high speed. Relays clicked with mechanical rhythm, their chatter echoing like typewriters in overdrive. The first Bombe, nicknamed Victory, was completed in 1940, a towering apparatus of wires, switches, and spinning cylinders. When switched on, it roared to life, whirring through possibilities that would have taken human hands months to exhaust. For the first time, the impossible seemed within reach. Yet the Bombe was not a single solution, but the beginning of a fleet, for one machine alone could not conquer the daily flood of messages. Still, it was a turning point in the hidden war, and it was Turing's vision that had made it possible. Turing's work in Hut 8 focused particularly on the naval Enigma, where the stakes were highest. Britain's survival depended on Atlantic convoys, carrying food, fuel, and weapons across waters haunted by U-boats. Each convoy lost meant starvation, empty fuel tanks, or crippled armies in distant theaters. Ultra-intelligence, decrypted through Enigma, offered the only way to anticipate wolfpack ambushes and redirect ships to safety. But naval Enigma was brutally difficult, with more rotors, fewer mistakes by operators, and rigid discipline in encryption. Turing's bombs attacked these messages relentlessly, grinding through possibilities until the day's key could be revealed. Each success was a victory, not of soldiers but of logic, as though mathematics itself had rescued ships from the depths. Yet failures were constant and deadlines cruel, for a missed day meant intelligence lost forever. The pressure on Turing and his colleagues was immense, and still they persevered, guided by the belief that every cracked key might save thousands of lives. Turing's colleagues at Bletchley remembered him not only for his brilliance, but also for his peculiar humanity. He jogged daily around the park, sometimes in gas mask or shorts, muttering equations as he ran. He spoke little of personal matters, though his homosexuality, then a criminal offence in Britain, was quietly known among some colleagues. Despite the secrecy, friendships formed, and his colleagues valued him for his generosity of intellect and dedication to the work. He was a man of contradictions, awkward yet warm, solitary yet essential to the team. His presence gave Hut 8 both inspiration and frustration, for his ideas often outpaced what others could implement. Yet even those who struggled to keep up knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Turing's name was rarely spoken outside the wire-fenced world of Bletchley, his identity cloaked under layers of secrecy. But within those huts, he was already a legend, and his legend was growing with every decrypted message. By 1940, the bomb had become the Allies' most powerful weapon against Enigma, and Alan Turing its quiet architect. His innovations transformed Bletchley Park from an eccentric country house into the beating heart of Allied intelligence. The machines multiplied, deployed across Britain in stations where Wrens operated them in shifts around the clock. Each successful run unlocked torrents of intelligence that shaped naval strategy, convoy routes, and military planning. Turing's fusion of mathematics, logic, and engineering had brought the impossible within reach. Yet the man himself remained modest, often downplaying his role and shunning the spotlight. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from the thrill of solving the puzzle. The war would continue, and Enigma would grow more complex, demanding still greater innovation. But Turing's arrival had changed everything, and the silent battle of minds had found its most brilliant champion. The bomb was more than a machine. It was a leap of imagination, a transformation of mathematics into metal, wires, and motion. At its heart, it was designed to simulate the workings of multiple enigmas at once, spinning through rotor positions with relentless precision. Rows of rotating drums represented enigma rotors, each wired to replicate their permutations in parallel. As the drums turned, electrical currents raced through circuits, testing rotor combinations against logical chains derived from cribs. Instead of solving Enigma directly, the bomb eliminated impossibilities, stripping away millions of settings in minutes. The machine's speed lay not in guessing answers, but in ruling out contradictions with ruthless efficiency. Relays clicked like machine gun fire, a mechanical heartbeat of the hidden war. When a logical pathway remained unbroken, the bomb signaled a stop, a candidate key worth human verification. In this way, it transformed the impossible into the achievable, and with every run, it pulled secrets out of German airwaves. The first bomb, nicknamed Victory, was unveiled in 1940, its black metal frame standing taller than a man. It bristled with rotating drums arranged in sets of 3, their spinning echoing the movement of Enigma rotors. Behind the frame stretched banks of relays, cables, and switches, a tangle of engineering that hummed when electricity coursed through it. Operators wired the machine by hand, connecting plug boards that mirrored Enigma's settings for the test. Once running, The Bombe created an almost hypnotic spectacle, rows of drums spinning, relays snapping, lights flickering in sequence. Each pass devoured hours of human labor that would otherwise have been wasted. The machine was not infallible, producing false stops that analysts had to weed out with painstaking care. But even with its imperfections, it cut days of effort into hours. The contrast with hand calculations was staggering, a revolution in both speed and scale, and victory was only the beginning. Scaling the Bombe into a fleet was an industrial effort that required secrecy, precision, and resources. Britain could ill afford. The British Tabulating Machine Company in Letchworth became the factory of the secret war, its engineers working day and night under veils of classification. Harold "Doc" Keane, the chief engineer, coordinated production, transforming Turing's abstract designs into robust hardware. Every wire, drum, and relay had to be crafted to exact tolerances, for even a minor flaw could derail operations. Components were tested obsessively, their reliability vital to the daily race against German key changes. The work was hidden behind innocuous facades, as if the company produced nothing more than ordinary calculating machines. In reality, it was churning out weapons of logic as critical as any tank or aircraft. By 1941, additional bombers rolled off the production line, each one expanding Bletchley Park's capacity. The machines were named with patriotic pride: Agnes, Aunt Sally, Good Luck, and more. Each one was a silent soldier, fighting a war of relays and permutations. The Bombe's design was elegant in its brutality, reducing Enigma's astronomical possibilities to manageable proportions. It began with a crib, a guessed piece of plain text within a message, carefully aligned with its ciphertext. From this anchor, analysts constructed a menu, a logical diagram of letter relationships that the Bombe would test. Plugged into the machine's wiring, the menu dictated how currents flowed through the spinning drums. As the rotors turned, the machine checked whether contradictions appeared. If a letter was forced to equal itself, the path was invalid. In seconds, entire swathes of the search space were discarded, narrowing the hunt. When a pathway survived, the machine paused, issuing a stop that analysts recorded and tested on replica enigmas. The method required both human insight and mechanical power, a partnership of intellect and engineering. Without the crib, the Bombe was blind. Without the Bombe, the crib was impotent. Together they formed the sharpest spear against German secrecy. Operating the Bombe was grueling, repetitive, and yet infused with urgency. The machines were housed in outstations such as Eastcote and Stanmore, where members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, Wrens, manned them in shifts. Dressed in uniforms, these young women worked amid the roar of motors and the staccato of relays, wiring plug boards and logging results. They lived in secrecy, never knowing the full importance of their work, only that every stop mattered. Long hours, cold huts, and the ever-present pressure of midnight deadlines became their routine. False stops frustrated operators, but the thrill of a genuine find carried them through exhaustion. Many later recalled the sense of being part of something vast yet invisible, their labor woven into the hidden fabric of victory. Without their diligence, the Bombers would have been useless machines, their potential unrealized. They were the hands that kept logic alive, and their quiet service was one of the great unsung acts of the war. The success of the Bombe depended on constant refinement, for the Germans did not stand still. In 1940 and 1941, procedural changes, new rotors, and stricter discipline threatened to outpace Bletchley's machinery. Gordon Welchman introduced the diagonal board, a brilliant modification that expanded the logical depth of the Bombe's tests. This addition multiplied the machine's efficiency, reducing false stops and accelerating the elimination of dead ends. With Welchman's improvement, the Bombe became not just a tool, but a weapon of scale, capable of processing daily settings in time to matter. The Germans, confident in Enigma's invulnerability, never suspected that their messages were being devoured by British machines. Each tweak to their procedure only spurred further innovation at Bletchley, where mathematicians and engineers adapted with relentless determination. The machine itself was not static. It evolved as the war did, growing sharper with every challenge. The contest became a duel between German secrecy and Allied ingenuity, and with the Bombe, the balance was shifting. The impact of the Bombe was felt far beyond the huts of Bletchley Park. Each day's successful run produced decrypted settings that unlocked torrents of messages, pouring into intelligence offices with unprecedented speed. Ultra, the code name for this intelligence, revealed U-boat positions, Luftwaffe raid plans, and troop movements across occupied Europe. Convoys were rerouted, ambushes avoided, and commanders armed with foresight that seemed almost supernatural. Admirals in the Atlantic marveled at their uncanny ability to outmaneuver wolf packs, unaware that the secret lay in spinning drums and relays. Generals on land found German maneuvers anticipated and countered, their advantage blunted by invisible hands. The Bombe was not a weapon that killed, but one that saved lives by the thousands. Its power lay not in destruction, but in revelation, shining light where enemies believed there was only darkness. And in that light, the war began to turn. By 1943, the Bombe network had grown into an industrial machine of its own. With dozens operating across Britain, thousands of Wrens, engineers and analysts sustained the relentless tempo, ensuring that not a single day's traffic was wasted. Each machine represented the convergence of mathematics, engineering and human persistence, a synergy that defined the Allied war effort. Turing's vision had been realized and expanded, his idea now multiplied into a fleet of machines humming in unison. Welchman's modifications, Keen's engineering, and the Wren's tireless operation transformed the Bombe into a system greater than the sum of its parts. Yet secrecy cloaked it all. Few outside Bletchley knew the machines even existed. To the Germans, Enigma remained unbreakable, their confidence unshaken even as their messages betrayed them. But history would remember the Bombe as one of the most decisive inventions of the war. It was a machine born of intellect, sustained by labor, and sharpened by necessity. And it ensured that the Allies never again fought blind. Bletchley Park was not a battlefield of guns and trenches, but a world of paper, pencils, and machines where war was fought in silence. Each morning and evening, intercepted messages arrived from Y stations scattered across Britain, carried in sealed envelopes or transmitted over secure lines. The day's work began not with bugles or parades, but with analysts bent over ciphertext, scrawling notes under flickering lamps. Huts rattled with the hum of bombers, the chatter of typewriters, and the low murmur of conversations in clipped whispers. Workers lived by the clock, for German operators reset Enigma at midnight, forcing the race to start anew each day. The atmosphere was charged with urgency, but also with monotony, for thousands of messages had to be sifted, catalogued and tested. Yet everyone understood that hidden among the pages of gibberish might be intelligence that saved convoys, divisions, or even nations. The weight of secrecy pressed on every shoulder, binding clerks, linguists, and mathematicians into a single invisible army. Their weapons were logic and discipline, their shield was silence, and their victory was measured not in parades, but in intercepted words. Secrecy, governed every detail of life at Bletchley Park, shaping the culture as much as the work itself. All staff signed the official Secrets Act, swearing never to reveal what they did, even to family or closest friends. This oath meant that husbands and wives might live side by side, each working at Bletchley, yet neither knowing the other's task. Workers invented vague cover stories, speaking of clerical jobs or routine office duties that hid the true significance of their labor. Even decades later, many veterans struggled to break the habit of silence, so deeply ingrained was the culture of secrecy. Inside the huts, work was compartmentalized to prevent leaks, with each team seeing only a fragment of the whole. A cryptographer might know Enigma keys, but never where the messages came from. A linguist might translate traffic without knowing how it had been decrypted. This enforced ignorance created frustration, but also provided security. No single captured worker could compromise the system, and so the greatest secret of the war was preserved by 1,000 small silences. Daily routines at Bletchley were grueling, demanding both endurance and precision. Shifts often stretched late into the night, for intelligence lost by dawn could mean ships sunk or soldiers ambushed. The huts themselves were cold in winter and stifling in summer, their makeshift construction never intended for thousands of workers. Tea was rationed, food was plain, and blackout curtains ensured that no light betrayed the estate to German bombers. Workers huddled in coats at their desks, ink freezing in pens during the harsh winters of 1940 and 1941. The relentless pressure of deadlines pushed many to exhaustion, yet few complained openly. Every worker knew they were part of something far greater than themselves, a hidden struggle whose consequences they felt daily in newspaper headlines. Small comforts, an extra cup of cocoa, a cigarette shared, a gramophone in the corner, offered brief respite from the weight of war. Friendships formed quickly, sustained by the shared burden of secrecy and fatigue. Life inside Bletchley was a crucible of stress and camaraderie, and in that crucible, ordinary people became extraordinary. Women formed the backbone of Bletchley Park, comprising nearly 3/4 of its workforce. The Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens operated the Bombe's wiring plugboards, monitoring relays, and logging results in endless shifts. Their diligence turned machines of metal into weapons of intelligence, catching stops that led to breakthroughs. In the huts, women served as clerks, translators, indexers, and traffic analysts, their patience and precision essential to the vast machinery of decryption. Many were young, scarcely out of school, recruited for their sharp minds and steady hands. Some had studied languages, others mathematics, while many had no idea what role they would play until they arrived at the gates. They worked in secrecy, often believing their tasks mundane, never told that their efforts might be saving convoys from destruction. For decades after, their contributions were overshadowed by the fame of a few mathematicians. Yet without their labor, the bombs would have been silent and the intelligence pipeline dry. These women carried the war on their shoulders as much as any soldier, and their silence after the war was as faithful as their service during it. The human side of Bletchley Park revealed itself in small, vivid details of daily life. Workers bicycled through Buckinghamshire lanes, their pockets stuffed with papers they dared not discuss. At lunchtime, queues formed at the canteen, where meagre rations were stretched to feed thousands of hungry minds. In the evenings, dances were held in the mansion's grand rooms, where young men and women briefly escaped the weight of secrecy. Relationships blossomed, marriages were formed, and friendships endured for life, all under the veil of wartime. Some found solace in music, playing pianos in common rooms, their notes drifting through the darkened huts. Others took long walks across the grounds, minds still buzzing with the day's permutations. In these moments of respite, the park felt almost like a university, alive with youth and potential. Yet outside the gates, bombs fell on cities and soldiers died on battlefields, reminders of why the work mattered. Life inside Bletchley was a strange mixture of ordinary and extraordinary, and its ordinariness was what gave the extraordinary its strength. Personalities at Bletchley were as diverse as its tasks, a patchwork of eccentricities bound by common purpose. Mathematicians scribbled formulas on blackboards, lost in thought even at mealtimes. Linguists debated grammar over tea, slipping between German, Italian, and Latin as if changing coats. Clerks kept meticulous indexes, building card files that linked intercepted call signs, locations, and operators into a web of intelligence. Engineers tinkered with machines late into the night, grease-stained hands coaxing life from reluctant relays. Some workers were aristocrats, others farm girls, yet here their backgrounds mattered little. The only currency was ability, and the only hierarchy was performance. The brilliance of Alan Turing, the leadership of Gordon Welchman, the tireless labor of anonymous Wrens, all carried equal weight in the hidden war. Eccentricities were tolerated, even embraced, for genius often came wrapped in odd habits. Bletchley Park became a place where difference was not weakness, but strength, and it was this mosaic of minds that made it so formidable. The psychological weight of the work was immense, for workers lived constantly with the knowledge of lives at stake. A missed clue might mean a convoy sunk, a regiment ambushed, or a city bombed. Yet they also knew that success was rarely visible, for the fruits of their labor were disguised, hidden in military orders that never mentioned their source. This invisibility was both blessing and curse, protecting their secret but denying them recognition. Stress manifested in exhaustion, illness, and frayed tempers, yet the mission kept them going. The knowledge that their work shortened the war became the fuel that carried them through fatigue. For many, the greatest satisfaction came from the smallest hints: a decrypted word, a cracked key, a stop on the bomb that proved genuine. These moments lit up huts filled with fatigue, small sparks of victory in a war of shadows. Every success was fleeting, for at midnight the Germans reset Enigma, and the chase began again. It was a Sisyphean struggle, but it was one that Bletchley Park never abandoned. By 1945, Bletchley Park had grown into a small city, with over 10,000 people laboring in its huts and outstations. Yet, despite its size, the secrecy remained airtight, the truth hidden from the public until decades after the war. The men and women who lived and worked there carried their silence into peacetime, returning to ordinary lives without revealing the extraordinary. Their work saved convoys in the Atlantic, guided bombers, and prepared the way for D-Day, but their neighbors knew them only as clerks, teachers, or housewives. The paradox of Bletchley was that its greatest achievement was its invisibility, its victory hidden behind silence. It was a world where intellect fought war, where anonymity was heroism, and where secrecy was both shield and prison. The daily lives of its workers, mundane yet monumental, formed the beating heart of Ultra, and it was in these routines of paper, tea, and sleepless nights that the fate of nations was decided. Bletchley Park was not just a place, it was a crucible where the human spirit met the machine age, and from it emerged a victory won in silence. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single clash, but a continuous, grinding struggle that stretched across 6 years of war. At its core lay a simple equation: Britain needed convoys to bring food, oil, and weapons across the Atlantic, while German U-boats sought to starve the island into submission. The ocean became a vast battlefield without front lines, where wolf packs hunted unseen beneath the waves. The stakes could not have been higher, for Britain imported nearly 2/3 of its food and fuel, lifelines vulnerable to steel predators lurking in the deep. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, believed that concentrated submarine attacks could strangle Britain within months. His Wolfpack tactics, coordinating submarines to overwhelm convoy escorts, proved devastating in the war's early years. Ships burned on the horizon, their cargoes swallowed by the sea, as convoys lost dozens of vessels in single voyages. Britain's survival hung by a thread, measured in tons of wheat and barrels of oil delivered to its ports. The Atlantic was not just a theatre of war, it was the Empire's jugular vein, and the U-boats were closing in. German confidence rested not only on steel and torpedoes, but also on the secrecy of Enigma. Every U-boat carried an Enigma machine, encrypting orders, positions, and Wolfpack assignments in what Donitz believed was unbreakable code. From bases in occupied France, signals flowed to submarines across the ocean, directing them with precision invisible to Allied eyes. Convoys sailed blind into traps, unaware that their courses had already been plotted in Berlin. Enigma was the silent weapon that multiplied U-boat effectiveness, ensuring coordination over vast distances. It gave Donitz a chessboard of the Atlantic, with submarines as pieces moved at will. The Allies, unable to read these orders, struggled to anticipate where Wolfpacks lay in wait. Escort commanders fought courageously, but often in darkness, their decisions reactive rather than preemptive. To break Enigma was to turn on the lights in the darkest theatre of the war, and it was in this contest that Bletchley Park's breakthroughs proved decisive. The early years were bleak, for the naval Enigma proved far harder to break than its Army or Air Force counterparts. The Kriegsmarine used additional rotors, stricter discipline, and more secure key procedures that frustrated cryptographers. Each day's messages represented billions of possible combinations, and missed keys meant convoys sailed without warning. Yet slowly, painfully, Bletchley Park began to pierce the veil, aided by captured codebooks and lucky hauls from stricken U-boats. In 1941, HMS Bulldog seized Enigma materials from U-110 before the submarine sank, a prize of incalculable value. With these clues, analysts in Hut 8, led by Alan Turing, could synchronize their bombs to naval procedures. The first breakthroughs were partial, providing glimpses rather than complete clarity. But even fragments of decrypted traffic allowed convoys to be rerouted away from waiting Wolfpacks. For the first time, Donitz's invisible hand was countered by Allied foresight, and the tide of the Atlantic battle began to shift. Convoys became the lifeblood of Britain, immense floating cities guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft where possible. Each convoy carried the weight of strategy: tanks for North Africa, grain for London, oil for the RAF, and munitions for distant fronts. The men aboard lived in constant dread of periscopes and torpedoes, their nights lit by burning tankers and shattered hulls. Wolfpack attacks were terrifying in their coordination, dozens of submarines converging on convoys in running battles that lasted for days. Yet ultra-intelligence, drawn from Enigma decrypts, gave convoy commanders the chance to evade these deadly ambushes. A sudden course change, issued without explanation, might save dozens of ships, though the crews never knew why. Admiralty charts grew marked with invisible red lines, corridors of danger only Bletchley could see. Slowly sinkings declined, and morale steadied, for convoys that once seemed doomed began to slip through the gauntlet. Men spoke of luck, of fate, of guardian angels watching over the fleet. In truth, their guardian was logic, humming in machines hidden in Buckinghamshire. The Germans, unaware their cipher had been pierced, grew puzzled by Allied successes. Donitz suspected spies in his command, unable to imagine that Enigma itself had been compromised. He introduced procedural changes, new rotors and more rigid discipline, but Bletchley adapted in response. Gordon Welchman's diagonal board enhanced the Bombe's efficiency, keeping pace with German improvements. Each innovation in Berlin was matched by counter-innovation in Britain, an invisible duel of intellect spanning oceans. Even when the four-rotor Enigma was introduced in 1942, temporarily blinding Bletchley, captured codebooks from U-559, restored the Allies' vision. The war of machines and minds never paused, and each victory was fragile, threatened by German adaptation. Yet the steady rhythm of decrypts, carried daily to the Admiralty, gave the Allies a decisive edge. By mid-1943, the U-boats found themselves not predators but prey, hunted by convoys that seemed uncannily evasive. The hunter had become the hunted, and the secret lay in broken code. Technology on the surface reinforced intelligence from the shadows, creating a synergy that doomed the U-boats. High-frequency direction finding, huff-duff pinpointed submarine transmissions, often guided by Bletchley's decrypts. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, making Wolfpack assembly more perilous than ever. Radar and improved sonar gave escorts sharper eyes, while hedgehog mortars and depth charges added teeth to their bite. Yet none of these tools would have been effective without knowing where to apply them. Ultra ensured that Allied assets were concentrated where danger loomed largest, maximizing their limited resources. A convoy that might once have been scattered and slaughtered could now be shepherded safely across. Sailors began to notice that their commanders seemed unnaturally prescient, rerouting before danger materialized. Few guessed that the source was a mansion of huts and machines far from the sea. The ocean was vast, but intelligence narrowed it to a map of opportunities. And on that map, the Allies seized the initiative. For the men aboard U-boats, the shift was palpable, though they did not understand its cause. Once hunters, they now found themselves ambushed, depth charges hammering their hulls with merciless precision. Convoys seemed to vanish before their eyes, slipping away as though guided by fate itself. Losses mounted, morale crumbled, and the Atlantic turned from a battlefield of opportunity into a graveyard of steel. Crews endured claustrophobic patrols, weeks of damp hunger and fear, only to return to shrinking bases on the French coast. Donitz's once proud Wolfpack strategy collapsed under the combined weight of technology and intelligence. Even his faith in Enigma, his most trusted shield, could not protect him, for he never suspected its betrayal. By 1943, U-boat sinkings outpaced construction, a reversal that sealed Germany's strategic defeat at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic, once Germany's greatest chance for victory, had slipped irretrievably away, and Enigma, once its strength, had become its undoing. The breaking of Enigma was not the sole factor in Allied victory in the Atlantic, but it was the keystone. Without ultra-intelligence, radar, sonar, and escorts would have been scattered, their efforts diluted across the vast ocean. Without ultra, convoys would have continued to bleed. Britain perhaps starved into surrender before American might could tip the balance. Instead, the secret war in Buckinghamshire ensured that the lifelines stayed open, that supplies flowed, and that Britain endured. The cost was immense. Thousands of sailors drowned, convoys shattered, and oceans littered with wreckage. But the tide had turned. For the first time since 1939, the Allies could see the outlines of victory, shaped not only by firepower, but by intellect. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that wars were not won solely on decks and in conning towers, but also in huts filled with chalkboards and wires. Enigma had promised the Germans secrecy. Instead, it delivered them betrayal. and Bletchley Park had ensured that the Atlantic belonged not to the wolf packs, but to the convoys that kept freedom alive. The Kriegsmarine's version of Enigma stood as the most formidable of all. A cipher machine wrapped not only in complexity, but in discipline. Unlike the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht, whose operators grew sloppy under pressure, German naval communicators followed procedures with near-religious precision. Admiral Karl Dönitz demanded absolute adherence to cryptographic discipline, knowing that his U-boat fleet lived or died by secrecy. Operators were trained to avoid repetition, to guard against predictable phrases, and to change settings with ruthless regularity. Every submarine commander carried not only the machine itself, but also codebooks updated monthly, making capture and exploitation even more difficult. The Naval Enigma used additional rotors, providing billions more possible permutations than the versions used by other services. This difference alone added layers of difficulty that stretched the limits of human calculation and mechanical assistance. For cryptographers at Bletchley, the challenge was like staring at a locked vault, whose combination changed daily. They knew the key was inside, but the tumblers were infinite, and the clock never stopped ticking. The consequences of this cryptographic strength were brutal in the Atlantic. In 1940 and 1941, Allied convoys suffered catastrophic losses, their routes tracked with precision by U-boat wolfpacks. Without consistent breaks into Naval Enigma, the Admiralty fought blind, reacting to attacks rather than anticipating them. Escorts, already stretched thin, were forced to defend convoys without knowledge of when or where the next strike would fall. Each torpedoed tanker or cargo ship represented not only material loss, but also the tightening of a noose around Britain's survival. Sailors whispered about German foresight, as though the enemy had spies in every Admiralty office. In truth, it was Enigma that carried their doom, its unbroken messages directing submarines with uncanny precision. Convoys became floating coffins, their fate sealed by the failure to pierce the Kriegsmarine's cipher. At Bletchley, the frustration was overwhelming, for they could taste success in other services' traffic, yet remained blind at sea. The Naval Enigma was not just a challenge, it was a torment, and it threatened to decide the war. Alan Turing and Hut 8 bore the brunt of this seemingly insurmountable problem. Day after day, they wrestled with ciphertexts that defied even the most advanced bombers. Turing, with his quiet intensity, pressed for deeper mathematical approaches, searching for patterns buried beneath layers of permutations. Gordon Welchman refined Bombe techniques, while other analysts scoured messages for cribs, those fleeting phrases that could anchor logic. Yet naval discipline meant cribs were scarce, denying them the footholds that had unlocked so many Luftwaffe messages. The hut became a place of exhaustion and obsession, its workers driven by the knowledge that convoys sank while they struggled. Analysts worked late into the night, scratching notes, swapping ideas, and cursing the precision of German operators. The intellectual pressure was matched by emotional strain, as each failed attempt carried the weight of unseen deaths at sea. It was not simply a puzzle, it was a battle measured in lives, and in Hut 8 every misstep felt like a defeat. Breakthroughs, when they came, were often the result of courage and chance on the high seas. In May 1941, HMS Bulldog captured U-110 before it sank, seizing codebooks and Enigma materials that electrified Bletchley Park. For the first time, naval procedures were laid bare, and Turing's bombes could be synchronized with greater confidence. These prizes were rare, and often won at terrible risk, as boarding parties fought time, flooding, and the threat of booby traps in sinking submarines. Each captured codebook extended Bletchley's vision for weeks or months, buying precious windows of clarity in the Atlantic. Yet the Germans adapted quickly, changing settings and distributing new keys to erase Allied advantage. The struggle became a cycle of breakthroughs followed by darkness, light flickering and fading with each captured prize. Intelligence gained in these windows saved convoys and exposed wolf packs, but the uncertainty gnawed at planners. Commanders longed for consistent daily insight, not brief flashes, and only deeper mastery of naval enigma could provide it. The introduction of the four-rotor Enigma in early 1942 plunged Bletchley Park into crisis. This new variant, deployed to U-boats operating in the Atlantic, expanded the cipher space to a scale that dwarfed previous efforts. Messages that had once yielded to bomber attacks now resisted, their permutations stretching beyond mechanical reach. For months, convoys once again sailed blind, losses mounting as German submarines prowled unchecked. Analysts at Hut 8 despaired, fearing the edge they had carved out was gone for good. The urgency grew desperate, for Britain's imports fell to critical lows, and defeat by starvation seemed plausible. It was at this darkest hour that fortune intervened once more. In October 1942, sailors from HMS Petard boarded the sinking U-559, seizing codebooks at the cost of their own lives. Their sacrifice cracked open the four-rotor mystery, giving Bletchley the foothold it needed. From tragedy and courage at sea came triumph in the huts of Buckinghamshire. With the four-rotor problem tackled, the Bombes returned to life, humming through rotor permutations at breakneck speed. Engineers refined the machines, and Wrens operated them in shifts around the clock, turning the tide of the cryptographic war. Each successful run yielded keys that unlocked torrents of naval traffic, transforming convoy routing from guesswork to science. Suddenly, Admiralty orders anticipated wolf packs with uncanny accuracy, steering ships away from danger with invisible foresight. U-boat commanders found themselves frustrated, convoys slipping past their traps, their successes dwindling. The German faith in Enigma remained unshaken, never suspecting that the machine itself had been compromised. For Bletchley's workers, the sense of victory was quiet but profound, their exhaustion lightened by the knowledge of lives saved. Naval Enigma had not been invulnerable after all. It had simply required persistence, sacrifice, and brilliance to crack. The relief was immense, but so too was the renewed responsibility. For each day's victory was erased at midnight, and the war of rotors began anew. The battle against Naval Enigma was not solely mathematical. It was also organizational and human. Bletchley Park expanded Hut 8's resources, bringing in more mathematicians, linguists, and clerical staff to handle the growing workload. New bomber stations at Eastcote and Stanmore multiplied capacity, turning decryption into an industrial process. The Wrens' relentless labor became the heartbeat of this effort, their discipline and precision matching the Germans' own intelligence officers. At the Admiralty translated decrypted traffic into operational orders, often within hours of interception. This speed of turnaround was unprecedented, giving convoys real-time guidance against threats thousands of miles away. The collaboration between sea and shore became seamless, a marriage of cryptography and strategy. For the first time, the Allies wielded consistent superiority in the Atlantic, and it was built not on ships or weapons, but on the minds and machines of Bletchley Park. Naval Enigma, once the Allies' greatest torment, had become their greatest triumph. By 1943, the struggle over Naval Enigma had shifted from desperation to dominance. The once mighty U-boat fleet found itself harried, hunted, and defeated in battles where the Allies seemed to know their every move. Convoys once decimated now crossed the Atlantic with growing confidence, shielded by foresight born of broken code. The men of Hut 8 and their colleagues across Bletchley had turned mathematics into strategy, logic into survival. Their victory was not loud, not marked by parades, but measured in cargo safely delivered, and sailors returned home alive. It was a triumph of persistence, forged from frustration, sacrifice, and intellectual firepower. The naval enigma had been the Germans' strongest card, their shield against Allied eyes. Yet in the end, it became their downfall, betrayed by discipline that made their signals predictable, and by courage that captured their secrets. The Atlantic lifeline remained open, and Britain endured, and it was endurance, born of Enigma's unraveling, that made ultimate victory possible. The battle against Enigma was never waged solely in the quiet huts of Bletchley Park. Intelligence was a mosaic, and some of its most vital pieces came not from mathematics, but from blood and steel on the front lines. Daring commando raids, clandestine espionage missions, and the boarding of stricken U-boats all supplied the precious codebooks that gave cryptographers their footholds. These operations were fraught with peril, for German crews were trained to destroy their Enigma materials the moment capture seemed likely. Flames, seawater, and weighted bags sent countless documents to the ocean floor before Allied hands could touch them. Yet when chance and courage aligned, codebooks fell into Allied possession, igniting breakthroughs that Hut 8 could not have achieved alone. The synergy between battlefield daring and intellectual brilliance became the lifeblood of Ultra, for without the sacrifices of sailors and spies, the machines at Bletchley would have had nothing to test, and without Bletchley those sacrifices would have meant little more than fleeting trophies. One of the earliest and most dramatic victories came in May 1941 with the capture of U-110. After a brutal depth charge attack in the North Atlantic, the crippled submarine surfaced, its crew abandoning ship in panic. HMS Bulldog, under Captain Joe Baker Creswell, dispatched a boarding party to seize the vessel before it sank. Inside, sailors discovered an intact Enigma machine and vital codebooks, left behind in the chaos of evacuation. The find electrified Bletchley Park, providing the first sustained insight into Kriegsmarine procedures. Analysts pored over the documents, aligning them with intercepted traffic, and for weeks the veil of secrecy was lifted. Convoys were rerouted, U-boat wolf packs were dodged, and lives were saved by the courage of men who had risked drowning in the depths. The capture of U-110 became a legend, whispered in corridors at Bletchley and celebrated quietly in Admiralty rooms. It was proof that code-breaking was not only a matter of logic, but also of daring at sea, and it was only the beginning. Espionage also played its shadowy role, with agents risking everything to obtain cryptographic material behind enemy lines. The Special Operations Executive, Britain's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, deployed operatives to sabotage, spy, and seize documents vital to the intelligence war. Agents infiltrated occupied ports, bribed or coerced enemy clerks, and smuggled information across borders. In some cases, brave civilians in occupied Europe passed on notes about German communication habits, revealing procedural weaknesses that Bletchley could exploit. Neutral nations became battlegrounds of espionage, where diplomats, spies, and double agents circled one another like predators in the dark. Sweden, Spain, and Switzerland all hosted covert meetings where snippets of German naval practice leaked to Allied ears. These fragments, when stitched together, provided invaluable context for cryptographers searching for patterns. Yet espionage was never without cost, for captured agents faced torture, execution, or disappearance into camps. Still, they persisted, knowing their fragments of knowledge could shift the balance of the war, and their shadows reached all the way to Buckinghamshire. Some of the most critical contributions came not from human agents, but from raw courage during naval warfare. Boarding a sinking submarine was among the most dangerous missions a sailor could face, for explosions, flooding, and booby traps lurked in every compartment. Yet time and again British sailors threw themselves into these death traps, prying loose books, ciphers, and rotors that would later feed Bletchley's machines. In October 1942, HMS Petard provided one of the most famous examples when Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier boarded the sinking U-559. Together with canteen assistant Tommy Brown, they retrieved codebooks before the sub plunged beneath the waves. Fasson and Grazier were dragged down and killed, their sacrifice immortalized in the secret victories their documents enabled. At Bletchley, analysts who never saw the sea knew that their breakthroughs were purchased with such acts of heroism. Each codebook captured was stained with salt water, sweat, and sometimes blood, and each one became the spark that lit the darkness of Enigma. Commando raids also fed the cryptographic war, striking deep into enemy territory to seize material. In 1942, Operation Biting, the Naval raid, targeted a German radar installation in occupied France. While the main prize was radar equipment, the raid reflected a broader pattern: the willingness to risk elite troops to capture technology and documents. Other raids specifically targeted Enigma materials, striking at weather stations, trawlers, and isolated garrisons where machines and logs were more vulnerable. These missions required stealth, precision, and ferocity, for failure meant capture or annihilation. At times, Royal Navy divers even scoured the wrecks of sunken vessels, braving mines and cold seas to salvage machines from twisted steel hulls. Each mission carried risks out of all proportion to its size, but the potential rewards were priceless. For in the War of Codes, a single document could outweigh an entire fleet engagement. The commandos knew this, and they fought with the same resolve as the men in the huts. In this way, battlefields and backrooms became one. Captured weather ships provided some of the most fruitful prizes in the hunt for Enigma. The Germans relied heavily on weather reports to guide their U-boat campaigns, and these vessels carried both Enigma machines and daily keys. In 1941, British forces seized the trawler Lauenburg, recovering valuable code materials that illuminated German procedures. Such captures were often overlooked in the grand sweep of battle, but for Bletchley they were lifelines. Weather traffic, with its predictable formats and constant flow, gave analysts reliable cribs for their bombs. This steady rhythm of intercepts provided anchors in the turbulent sea of naval enigma. Each report unlocked broader chains of logic, leading to convoy-saving intelligence. For the sailors who seized these trawlers, the mission seemed mundane, but its consequences echoed across the Atlantic. In the silent huts of Buckinghamshire, the Lauenburg's documents were transformed into lives saved, and so even small victories at sea carried disproportionate weight in the war of signals. The symbiosis between field capture and cryptanalysis created a rhythm that defined the intelligence war. Every codebook seized extended Bletchley's vision by weeks, sometimes months, allowing analysts to break messages with confidence. Each gap filled by espionage or commando daring allowed the bombs to spin more effectively, narrowing the search space to solvable dimensions. Without these captures, Bletchley's machines would have been blind, grinding endlessly against billions of meaningless possibilities. With them, decryption became a daily reality, and ultra-intelligence flowed to Allied commanders in time to matter. Sailors, spies, and commandos became the unsung partners of mathematicians, their sacrifices inseparable from the breakthroughs in the huts. When convoy losses dropped, when U-boats were sunk, when Rommel's supplies faltered, The credit was shared between sea and land, between battlefield courage and intellectual firepower. Each capture was a bridge across worlds, connecting the chaos of war to the order of logic. And through these bridges, Enigma's secrets fell. By the war's end, the story of Enigma was as much about daring in the field as it was about brilliance at desks. The capture of U-110, the sacrifice aboard U-559, the raids on trawlers and weather ships, all fed into a vast machinery of intelligence that turned the tide. These acts of espionage and courage remained shrouded in secrecy for decades, their heroes unrecognized and their victories unspoken. Bletchley Park could not have triumphed without them, for logic alone cannot conjure starting points from thin air. Every page of captured cipher tables, every stolen rotor, and every seized book was a weapon wielded in the shadows. The Germans believed Enigma invulnerable because they trusted in mathematics alone. They forgot that wars are won by people, not machines, and people are always vulnerable to risk and courage. The Allies never forgot, and they built their cryptographic empire on this truth. Espionage, sacrifice, and code-breaking were three faces of the same war, and together they shattered Enigma's iron mask. The deserts of North Africa were unlike any other battlefield of the Second World War, vast expanses of sand stretching endlessly under blistering sun. Armored divisions clashed across these open spaces like ships at sea, their movements dictated by fuel, supply, and intelligence. At the heart of the German effort stood the Afrika Korps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, whose daring maneuvers earned him the title the Desert Fox. Rommel's reputation for boldness terrified his enemies, for he struck with speed and precision, outflanking Allied positions with uncanny foresight. Yet Rommel was not omniscient, for his moves were directed by signals flowing from Berlin, encrypted through Enigma machines. These messages carried the lifeblood of the campaign, supply schedules, troop movements, and strategic directives, intercepted by Y stations in the Mediterranean, and passed to Bletchley Park. They became the raw material of ultra-intelligence. With every cracked message, the Allies peered into Rommel's mind, anticipating his next thrust before it began. The war in the desert thus became a duel not only of tanks and guns, but of logic and secrecy, and in that duel, Enigma became the hidden prize. The Afrika Korps relied on supplies ferried across the Mediterranean from Italy, convoys vulnerable to Allied air and naval forces. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, had to cross waters stalked by British submarines and aircraft from Malta. Enigma encrypted signals directed these convoys, revealing routes, timings, and escort details. When Bletchley Park broke these messages, the intelligence was relayed swiftly to the Royal Navy and the RAF, transforming the convoys into targets. Entire shipments destined for Rommel's tanks were sunk before reaching Africa, their flames lighting the night seas. Without fuel, Rommel's vaunted mobility faltered, his tanks reduced to immobile hulks on the sand. The Germans never suspected that their lifeline was betrayed by their own cipher. They attributed their losses to Allied luck or superior reconnaissance, never imagining that every signal was being read. In truth, the Desert War was not only fought in the dunes, it was decided on the desks of Hut 6 and Hut 8. Rommel's brilliance as a commander was both aided and undermined by Enigma. His daring maneuvers depended on precise coordination with his superiors, who issued orders encrypted through the machine. These instructions, when decrypted, gave Allied commanders a window into German planning at the highest levels. Ultra often revealed not only where Rommel would attack, but also the strength and composition of his forces. At times the Allies seemed almost clairvoyant, redeploying units to block his thrusts before they began. Yet secrecy demanded caution, For if the Germans suspected Enigma was compromised, the lifeline of intelligence would vanish. Orders were disguised, decisions framed as guesswork, and commanders instructed never to reveal the true source of their knowledge. This delicate balance, acting on intelligence without exposing its origin, was one of the great challenges of the Desert Campaign. To Rommel it seemed his opponents had uncanny instincts. To the Allies it was the fruit of relentless labor at Bletchley, and to history it was the proof that codes could break armies. The sands themselves added a unique dimension to the intelligence war. Desert warfare magnified the importance of logistics, for water, fuel, and spare parts mattered as much as guns and armor. Ultra decrypts revealed not only battle orders, but also the fragile arteries that sustained the Africa Corps. When convoys were sunk, fuel shortages crippled Rommel's ability to maneuver, turning his aggressive thrusts into desperate defenses. Reports intercepted from field units betrayed their exhaustion, their shortages, and even their reliance on captured Allied supplies. British commanders used this knowledge to time their offensives, striking when German fuel was lowest or ammunition scarce. Thus, the desert itself became a silent ally, amplifying the consequences of every broken signal. What seemed to soldiers as grinding battles across barren landscapes was at higher levels a chess match of supply and prediction. The sand swallowed armies, but it also revealed their weaknesses to those who could read the signs, and Ultra made those signs visible. Perhaps the most famous demonstration of Ultra's power came at El Alamein in late 1942. As General Bernard Montgomery prepared his counteroffensive, Bletchley Park supplied him with daily insights into Rommel's strength and intentions. Ultra revealed the state of German supply lines, the locations of minefields, and the timing of reinforcements. Armed with this knowledge, Montgomery was able to plan with confidence, ensuring that his forces struck at the moment of maximum advantage. The battle became a turning point, halting Rommel's advance and beginning the long retreat of the Africa Corps. Soldiers on the ground experienced the clash as brutal combat of shellfire, sandstorms, and smoke. But behind the scenes, Ultra had tilted the scales, ensuring that Montgomery fought with superior preparation. Rommel, starved of fuel and misled by his own encrypted orders, found his brilliance blunted. The Desert Fox had been trapped not only by tanks and artillery, but by the silent work of Bletchley Park, and the Desert War had turned in the Allies' favor. Yet the influence of Ultra in North Africa was never absolute. There were periods when Enigma changed procedures, blinding Bletchley and leaving convoys unmolested for weeks. During these gaps, Rommel regained momentum, striking with the speed and cunning that made him legendary. The Allies suffered reverses, their forces driven back across the sands, their supply lines strained to breaking. Soldiers cursed their luck, unaware that their commanders were suddenly without the invisible guidance they had come to rely on. At Bletchley, frustration grew during these periods, analysts redoubling their efforts to break the new keys. Success was never guaranteed, for the Germans adapted constantly, introducing new rotas and tighter discipline, but persistence prevailed, and the decrypts resumed, restoring the Allies' edge. The war in the desert was thus a pendulum, swinging between clarity and darkness, and every swing cost lives. The human side of Ultra in North Africa was felt in the quiet rooms where intelligence was digested and passed along. Clerks pored over intercepted traffic, linguists translated hurriedly, and naval officers plotted courses with trembling fingers. Every message had to be weighed, tested, and acted upon without revealing its origin. The pressure on intelligence officers was immense, for errors could mean convoys lost or opportunities squandered. In Cairo, intelligence centers became extensions of Bletchley, feeding decrypted insights directly to field commanders. The relationship between cryptographers in Britain and generals in Africa was one of unseen trust, bridging thousands of miles. For the young women and men in the huts, it was humbling to know that their calculations influenced the fate of battles in deserts they had never seen. The soldiers who fought under the blazing sun rarely knew of their invisible allies, but their victories were shared with those who never left Buckinghamshire. By the end of 1942, the Desert War had shifted decisively against the Axis. Rommel's aura of invincibility was broken, his supply lines strangled, his army pushed back toward Tunisia. Ultra-intelligence had been a decisive factor, not the only one, but the unseen hand that tilted the balance. The Afrika Korps had been undone as much by shortages and betrayed signals as by British tanks and artillery. Bletchley Park had shown that intelligence could be as lethal as firepower, that battles could be won in the shadows as well as in the sun. The victory in North Africa became a lesson for the Allies. Codes and ciphers were not abstract puzzles but weapons of war. From El Alamein onward, Ultra would shape campaigns across Europe from Sicily to Normandy. The sands of the desert had proven the power of broken enigma, and the shadow of Bletchley stretched from Buckinghamshire all the way to the burning dunes of North Africa. The skies of Europe were a battlefield of noise and fire, where the Luftwaffe sought to dominate through speed, coordination, and overwhelming raids. Every German squadron depended on precision timing, with aircraft launched in waves directed by encrypted orders flowing from headquarters. These commands, encoded through Enigma, determined when bomber streams would form, where fighters would rendezvous, and which cities would be struck. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, these signals carried the heartbeat of the Luftwaffe's campaign. Without them, raids would dissolve into chaos, squadrons colliding in the air or missing their targets entirely. For the Germans, Enigma was the shield of their aerial armada, ensuring that Britain could never anticipate the storm. But at Bletchley Park, Hot 6 focused its efforts on Luftwaffe traffic, probing for cracks in the system. What seemed unbreakable on the ground was vulnerable in the air, for pilots and radio operators grew sloppy in the heat of battle. Their errors became the handholds Bletchley needed, and those handholds became the difference between survival and destruction. The Battle of Britain was as much an intelligence war as it was a clash of machines in the sky. German bombers filled the skies by day, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters that challenged the RAF for supremacy. British radar gave early warnings, but ultra-intelligence, born of cracked Enigma, revealed deeper insights into German strategy. Intercepted traffic indicated target priorities, squadron strength, and operational intentions hours or even days in advance. This allowed Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding to position his limited squadrons with uncanny precision, conserving resources where they were least needed and concentrating them where the blow would fall. To Luftwaffe pilots, it seemed the RAF always appeared at the right place and time, as though guided by second sight. In truth, their own coded orders betrayed them, stripped bare by Bletchley's persistence. The result was not omnipotence, but efficiency, ensuring that Britain's outnumbered fighters were never wasted. The air war was thus fought not only with Spitfires and Hurricanes, but also with pencils, chalkboards, and bombes, and this invisible duel shaped the fate of nations. The structure of Luftwaffe communications made it vulnerable in ways the Kriegsmarine had avoided. German airmen relied heavily on predictable formats, reporting weather, altitude, and flight plans in ways that created consistent cribs. Pilots often repeated call signs or reused common phrases, habits that became gifts to cryptographers. The sheer volume of traffic, thousands of messages each day, provided more opportunities for errors to slip through. While Naval Enigma seemed impenetrable, Luftwaffe Enigma cracked more frequently, producing valuable decrypts in time to influence combat. Hut 6 became a hive of activity, its clerks and mathematicians laboring through endless streams of intercepted chatter. Each decrypted message was analyzed for patterns, cross-referenced against radar reports, and fed into fighter command's plotting rooms. There, young women of the WAAF moved markers across giant maps, guided by signals born from both technology and cryptanalysis. The fusion of these streams created an operational picture of unprecedented clarity, and in this picture, Britain found the means to resist. The air war was not confined to Britain, for ultra-intelligence shaped campaigns across Europe and the Mediterranean. Decrypts revealed the Luftwaffe's shifting priorities, from bombing raids over London to supply missions in Crete or troop movements in North Africa. When Rommel's Afrika Korps cried out for fuel, Ultra revealed the flight plans of transport aircraft ferrying supplies across the Mediterranean. RAF squadrons intercepted them, burning cargoes in the skies before they reached the desert. In the east, Luftwaffe messages betrayed reconnaissance flights probing Soviet defenses, their intentions visible to Allied analysts. The power of Ultra lay not only in predicting raids, but in understanding the structure of German air power itself. Through decrypted traffic, Bletchley Park could measure the attrition of squadrons, the training of new pilots, and the deployment of elite units. To generals and admirals, this knowledge was priceless, a lens into the strength and weakness of the Luftwaffe at any given moment. War in the air was dynamic, shifting daily, but Ultra ensured the Allies always had a map to follow. At the height of the Blitz, when London burned nightly under waves of bombers, Ultra provided a measure of defense that radar alone could not. Decrypts revealed intended targets, allowing civil defense forces to prepare, blackouts to be enforced, and anti-aircraft guns to be shifted. Civilians never knew that the warnings sometimes came not from radar screens but from cracked codes, their lives preserved by the work of unseen cryptographers. Yet secrecy demanded that Ultra remain invisible, its insights disguised as chance or the fruits of other intelligence sources. The weight of this secrecy was heavy, for those who toiled in the huts knew their work saved thousands, yet could never claim the credit. The Blitz became a trial of endurance, with British cities scarred by fire and rubble. But without Ultra, the destruction would have been worse, the losses far greater. The Luftwaffe's effort to break British morale faltered, blunted by foresight that Donitz submarines never suspected. And Britain endured, its heart scarred but unbroken. The Luftwaffe's reliance on Enigma also revealed the limitations of German faith in technology. Commanders believed their codes unassailable, and so they transmitted with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Even when raids failed or convoys were intercepted, suspicions rarely fell on Enigma itself. They blamed spies, luck, or radar, never grasping that their shield was compromised. This blindness allowed Bletchley to continue exploiting their traffic long after patterns should have raised alarms. In contrast, the Allies learned to adapt, never assuming that their codes were safe, constantly updating and refining procedures. The contrast between German rigidity and Allied flexibility became stark in the skies, where one side broadcasted its intentions and the other quietly listened. Ultra did not win the air war alone, but it tilted the balance at decisive moments. It magnified every RAF sortie, every defensive scramble, every interception, and in doing so, it helped deny the Luftwaffe the dominance Hitler had promised. The human side of the air intelligence war was no less vivid than the battles themselves. At Bletchley, young women typed endless lines of Morse, their ears tuned to rhythms of German chatter. Mathematicians scribbled on chalkboards, while analysts cross-checked intercepts against reconnaissance reports. In fighter command, controllers relied on this invisible stream to guide pilots into combat, issuing orders with calm urgency over crackling radios. Pilots, often exhausted from back-to-back sorties, never knew their missions were choreographed by minds far from the cockpit. To them, the war was lived in moments of terror and exhilaration, of tracers and vapor trails across the sky. To the cryptographers, it was a relentless grind, where missed keys meant missed chances to save lives. Both worlds were inseparable, though neither fully understood the other. It was a war fought in skies and in huts, in Spitfires and in equations. And it was this fusion that made resistance possible. By 1941, the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF, its raids blunted by radar, resilience and ultra-intelligence. Britain had endured its trial by fire, surviving an onslaught that Hitler had believed irresistible. The lessons learned in the air war became foundations for later campaigns, shaping Allied thinking on intelligence, deception, and coordination. Bletchley Park had proven its value not in theory but in survival, ensuring that the island fortress remained unconquered. The Luftwaffe's Enigma traffic continued to be exploited throughout the war, its secrets feeding into campaigns from the Mediterranean to Normandy. Yet it was in the Battle of Britain that its importance was first revealed, in a struggle where every scrap of intelligence could tip the scale. The air war showed that codes were not abstract puzzles, but weapons as real as bombs and bullets, and it demonstrated that even the mightiest air fleet could be humbled by foresight. In the silence of huts and the roar of dogfights, history was written, and the skies of Britain remained free. Ultra was more than intelligence. It was a secret so immense that it threatened to collapse under its own weight. Every decrypted message gave the Allies priceless insight into German operations, yet each decision to act carried the risk of exposure. If the Germans realized their Enigma was compromised, they would change the system, and the fragile advantage would vanish overnight. Thus, commanders were forced into the cruelest of calculations, balancing immediate lives against the survival of a secret weapon. At Bletchley Park, cryptographers worked tirelessly, yet they knew their achievements had to remain invisible. Credit could never be claimed, victories could never be explained, and sometimes tragedies had to be allowed. Allied leaders learned that secrecy was itself a weapon, one as critical as tanks or planes. Ultra's power was immense, but its fragility demanded restraint. To preserve it, decisions were shrouded in deception, and sacrifices were quietly accepted. It was the hidden burden of the intelligence war. The problem was never merely what Ultra revealed, but how to use it without giving the game away. If a convoy altered course too precisely, the Germans might suspect their codes were broken. If bombers struck targets with uncanny accuracy, questions might be raised within the Luftwaffe. Commanders learned to mask ultra-inspired decisions behind plausible alternatives, reconnaissance flights, agent reports, or supposed lucky guesses. This required a choreography of lies, weaving stories convincing enough to conceal the truth. Aircraft would be sent on patrols that just happened to stumble upon the right enemy fleet. Spies were sometimes credited with information they never actually supplied, becoming convenient scapegoats for the truth. Even within the Allied command, knowledge of Ultra was restricted to the few, guarded by secrecy orders backed by prison terms. In this way, the intelligence became a shadow within the war, powerful but invisible, and invisibility demanded constant vigilance. The stakes of secrecy were seen most starkly in the Atlantic, where Ultra often revealed the precise locations of U-boat wolfpacks. Convoys could be rerouted to safety, but not always, for too much precision risked suspicion. Sometimes, Ships were deliberately sacrificed, their crews sent into peril, so that the Germans remained convinced of their code's invincibility. To the men of the Admiralty, this was the cruelest burden, watching lives vanish in the Atlantic swells to protect a greater secret. The cold calculus weighed heavily on leaders, yet they knew the long-term survival of Ultra outweighed individual tragedies. To act without caution was to risk blinding Bletchley Park forever. And blindness in turn would cost far more lives than a single convoy. It was a bitter truth, one that officers carried in silence. The men on the ships never knew their fate was bound to the fragility of a cipher, and those who knew could never tell. Deception operations became the essential counterpart to Ultra, creating the illusions needed to explain Allied foresight. The British developed a mastery of deception, weaving false trails that misled the Germans at every turn. Aerial reconnaissance was staged to justify attacks planned from decrypts, ensuring that Ultra remained hidden behind a curtain of conventional intelligence. Double agents, run under the XX Committee, became mouthpieces for invented stories, feeding Berlin explanations designed to protect the truth. Weather reports, captured documents, and fabricated scouting missions all played their parts in this elaborate theatre. Perhaps the most famous example was Operation Mincemeat, which used a corpse carrying fake papers to misdirect German defences in 1943. Though not directly tied to Enigma, it reflected the same principle, hiding real intelligence behind layers of deception. Ultra's greatest victories were often inseparable from these tricks, the lie protecting the truth like armor. Without deception, Ultra could never have endured. With it, the Germans remained blind. The ethical dilemmas of Ultra were profound and enduring, for secrecy demanded silence even in the face of preventable death. Commanders knew about raids, attacks, and ambushes in advance, yet sometimes chose inaction to protect the source. Soldiers marched into traps that might have been avoided, their lives weighed against the preservation of the code-breaking advantage. Families never knew that their loved ones' fates had been sealed by deliberate silence. To those at Bletchley, the moral burden was crushing, for their brilliance was both saving lives and condemning others. Yet they understood the broader picture. The war was global, the stakes existential, and their secret too precious to risk. Leaders like Churchill famously described Ultra as my most secret source, shielding it with ruthless determination. In such a war, ethics bent under the weight of necessity. Ultra demanded sacrifices not only on the battlefield but in the conscience, and those sacrifices haunted many long after the war. The secrecy extended beyond the war itself, shaping memory and history for decades. For 30 years, Ultra remained hidden from the public, its veterans bound by the Official Secrets Act. Soldiers believed their survival had been the result of luck, never knowing the calculations that had saved them. Commanders were praised for foresight they had not possessed, their reputations built on intelligence they could never acknowledge. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park returned to ordinary lives, their contributions invisible to history. Families never knew the importance of the work their sons and daughters had performed in silence. Only in the 1970s did the truth begin to emerge, reshaping the narrative of the Second World War. By then, many who had carried the burden were gone, their secrets unspoken. The silence had preserved the advantage, but it had also silenced the recognition, and the greatest secret of the war remained hidden far too long. Yet the silence itself reveals the depth of discipline that Ultra demanded. It was not merely about cracking codes, but about controlling information, rationing it carefully so it could be trusted. At every level of command, a need-to-know policy ensured that only the essential few understood where the intelligence came from. Pilots, sailors, and infantry acted on Ultra's insights without ever knowing the source. Even generals received intelligence couched in vague terms, stripped of any reference to Bletchley Park. This compartmentalization was both protection and burden, creating an intelligence culture unlike any other in the war. It meant that Ultra's victories were never celebrated in the moment, always hidden, always disguised. And yet this invisibility was the key to its survival. For in war, a secret once revealed is a secret destroyed. By the end of the war, Ultra had proven its worth beyond question, but the burden of secrecy left scars as real as the victories. Leaders had learnt to wage not only open battle but hidden wars of silence, deception, and controlled sacrifice. Ultra had shaped campaigns from the Atlantic to El Alamein, from Stalingrad to Normandy, all under a cloak of denial. The ethical compromises, the sacrifices of ships and men, and the decades of secrecy afterward were the price of its preservation. Historians now look back with awe at its effectiveness, but also with unease at the moral shadows it cast. The story of Ultra is not only one of triumph, but also of restraint, deception, and silence. In the huts of Bletchley and the war rooms of London, decisions were made that saved millions yet doomed thousands. Such is the paradox of intelligence, where the greater good demands unbearable costs. Ultra was the weapon that could never be named, and secrecy was both its shield and its curse. In the spring of 1944, the greatest gamble of the war took shape on the shores of southern England. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, required precision on a scale never before attempted. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of ships, and waves of aircraft would converge on Normandy's beaches. Yet behind the massive armies lay a quieter weapon, the ability to read the enemy's mind through Enigma decrypts. Ultra-intelligence gave Allied planners a level of insight into German deployments that no previous invasion had enjoyed. Bletchley Park tracked the movements of divisions, the state of supply lines, and the readiness of coastal defences. Each decrypted message was another brushstroke painting the German order of battle in astonishing detail. This picture guided Eisenhower and Montgomery as they shaped the timing, scale, and deception of Overlord. Without Ultra, the landings would have been blind. With it, they became a calculated strike against the heart of Hitler's empire. The Germans had fortified the Atlantic Wall, a string of bunkers, minefields, and gun emplacements stretching from Norway to Spain. Yet its strength was uneven, and Ultra revealed precisely where those weaknesses lay. Intercepts showed which sectors were held by battle-hardened divisions and which were guarded by static or understrength units. Reports from Field Marshal Rommel, encrypted by Enigma, betrayed the fragility of German reserves. His warnings to Berlin, read by Allied commanders, revealed fuel shortages, overstretched defences, and the difficulty of rapid reinforcement. This intelligence shaped the choice of Normandy over the more obvious Pas-de-Calais. Hitler expected the main blow in the north, but Ultra confirmed his misallocation of forces. By striking at Normandy, the Allies would exploit German misjudgment, not simply their fortifications. The Atlantic Wall appeared formidable, but Ultra showed where its mortar crumbled, and that knowledge turned the impossible into the achievable. Secrecy, however, remained paramount, for Ultra could never be allowed to betray itself. Every action taken from decrypts had to be masked by plausible alternatives, whether reconnaissance flights or double-agent reports. The double-cross system, which controlled German spies in Britain, became the perfect screen. Messages to Berlin from these agents explained Allied moves that were actually dictated by Ultra. This ensured that when German commanders reacted to Allied decisions, they never questioned Enigma's security. In the months before D-Day, This deception reached its zenith in Operation Fortitude. False armies were created with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and fake radio traffic, all designed to convince Hitler that Pas de Calais was the target. Ultra then confirmed the success of this ruse, as German intercepts revealed their continuing fixation on Calais. Thus, secrecy was preserved even as intelligence shaped the invasion. Deception and decryption became inseparable twins of victory. Ultra also played a crucial role in the timing of the invasion, as weather and German expectations collided. The cross-channel assault demanded a narrow window of calm seas, moonlight, and favorable tides. Meteorologists debated fiercely, but decrypts provided reassurance about German readiness. Ultra revealed that many German commanders were away from their posts, believing storms had ruled out invasion. Rommel himself had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday, convinced the weather made landings impossible. Hitler slept through much of June 6th, shielded by aides from making hasty decisions. These small but vital details emerged from German traffic, showing the Allies not only what the enemy planned but what they believed. Timing became destiny, and Ultra's whispers reinforced Eisenhower's fateful choice to go on June 6. The landings began under clouds and uncertainty, but the enemy was caught off guard, and surprise was the Allies' greatest ally. Once the invasion began, Ultra continued to shape its progress, reading the enemy's desperate attempts to respond. German traffic revealed the paralysis of command, as conflicting orders from Berlin crippled effective counterattacks. Hitler insisted the landings were a feint, refusing to release panzer reserves for days. Ultra decrypted these orders, assuring the Allies that their beachheads could be secured before the full weight of German armor arrived. Intercepts also tracked the movements of reinforcements, allowing Allied bombers to strike rail lines and choke German logistics. Every day, Bletchley Park fed fresh intelligence into Secaf headquarters, guiding decisions with astonishing clarity. Commanders on the ground fought with grit, but their success was magnified by the invisible hand of Ultra. For the Germans, confusion and delay became fatal, as divisions that might have thrown the Allies back into the sea never arrived in time. Enigma, meant to protect, became their betrayer, and Normandy held. The naval dimension of Ultra in Overlord was equally decisive. German U-boats remained a lurking threat in the Channel, but decrypts revealed their patrol zones and operating orders. Allied destroyers swept these areas, hunting submarines before they could reach the invasion armada. Luftwaffe orders, read in advance, betrayed their limited capacity to mount large-scale raids against the beaches. This allowed Allied naval and air commanders to allocate resources more efficiently, protecting the vulnerable transports and landing craft. Minesweepers cleared channels with foreknowledge of where German defenses were strongest. Each of these seemingly minor decisions saved lives and preserved momentum in those critical first days. The invasion armada's survival was not luck. It was preparation forged from intelligence. The Germans never realized that their encrypted chatter guided the very weapons that destroyed them. Ultra was the silent convoy escort, the unseen air umbrella, the ghost in the Channel, and its presence was decisive. The ethical burden of Ultra was felt even amid triumph, for secrecy demanded that intelligence be wielded with restraint. Not every decrypted order could be acted upon, for overuse risked betraying the source. Some towns were bombed, some convoys ambushed, even when their fate was known in advance. Commanders had to accept losses to preserve the larger advantage, a grim calculus even in the midst of victory. Yet on balance, Ultra saved far more than it cost, guiding the greatest amphibious invasion in history. To the soldiers storming the beaches, victory seemed earned by blood, courage, and steel. They never knew that their odds had been tilted by invisible allies working in silence. Bletchley Park's operators, locked away in Buckinghamshire, bore the strange pride of victory without recognition. Their triumph could never be spoken, their burden never shared, and yet it was their silence that made the noise of battle bearable. By the time the Allies broke out from Normandy, the role of Ultra in D-Day was undeniable. Even if invisible, it had shaped the choice of beaches, the timing of the assault, and the masking of true intentions. It had preserved secrecy while delivering clarity, balancing deception and decision with delicate precision. It had read the enemy's mind at every stage, from Rommel's shortages to Hitler's misjudgments, and it had turned the mightiest gamble of the war into a calculated strike. For decades, veterans of Bletchley carried their secret, watching history praise commanders while their own role lay hidden. Only later did the truth emerge that the triumph of Normandy was not only the result of steel and sacrifice, but of silence and code-breaking. Enigma, meant to guard Hitler's empire, became the architect of its unraveling, and Ultra, born of secrecy, became the foundation of liberation. D-Day was not only a battle of beaches, it was a battle of ciphers. By 1944, the walls of the Third Reich were collapsing, and with them, the security of Enigma began to unravel. German armies retreated on every front, their once confident signals now laced with panic and desperation. Bletchley Park intercepted a flood of traffic, revealing in granular detail the disintegration of Hitler's empire. Messages spoke of fuel shortages, shattered supply lines, and divisions destroyed almost faster than they could be reported. Cryptographers, who once strained for scraps of information, now faced an avalanche of desperate pleas. Yet still, the work continued, for every decrypt shortened the war by hours, perhaps days. Even as Allied armies crossed the Rhine, Ultra's operators worked without pause, capturing the dying heartbeat of Nazi command. The great machine of Enigma had not been abandoned, for German faith in its invincibility remained astonishingly intact. Right until the end, commanders believed their orders secure, and right until the end, Bletchley proved them wrong. In the east, German signals betrayed the agony of armies crushed between the Red Army and Allied advance. Ultra provided insights into the chaos, showing Stalin's commanders where German defenses were weakest. Soviet offensives, timed with devastating precision, drove wedges through crumbling Wehrmacht formations. Every intercepted message painted a picture of collapse: ammunition convoys abandoned, orders lost, units fighting without supplies. Bletchley Park read Hitler's furious commands, detached from reality, demanding counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed. These decrypts, passed quietly to Allied leaders, confirmed what was already visible on the battlefield: the Reich was finished. Yet the intelligence remained invaluable, ensuring Allied commanders knew exactly where resistance remained strongest. In the ruins of Berlin, messages still flowed through Enigma, though often delayed, contradictory, or obsolete. It was as if the machine itself mirrored the empire it served, clattering on even as its world dissolved. And in those final signals, history recorded the death throes of Nazi Germany. The fate of the Kriegsmarine revealed the last illusions of German power. Even as ports fell and U-boats were hunted to extinction, Enigma encoded signals directed submarines on missions that could no longer be won. Ultra decrypted orders for desperate final patrols, sending crews into seas already dominated by Allied aircraft and destroyers. Young sailors embarked on missions that intelligence officers at Bletchley knew were suicides. Convoys sailed untouched, for the U-boats never reached them, betrayed at every turn by their own transmissions. Cryptographers read the final reports of submarines that would never return, a grim tally of wasted lives. The naval war that had once threatened Britain's survival ended in silence and wreckage. The mighty Kriegsmarine was undone not only by Allied steel, but by its faith in Enigma. And in its final months, the machine became less a weapon than a coffin. The ocean floor filled with its victims, still believing their codes unbroken. As Allied forces liberated cities across Europe, physical Enigma machines began to fall into their hands in unprecedented numbers. Units overran headquarters, captured trucks, and seized communication centers intact. Piles of rotors, codebooks, and machines were gathered up, confirming Bletchley's triumph in the most tangible form. What had once been the most closely guarded secret of the Reich became abandoned hardware, stripped of meaning by defeat. Soldiers who seized them often had no idea of their true significance, boxing them up as trophies of war. For the men and women at Bletchley, seeing these machines arrive in England must have been surreal. For years their lives had revolved around chasing the logic of these rotors, and now they were mere spoils. Yet even then secrecy demanded silence. The soldiers who captured them were rarely told the true value of what they had found. Enigma had been conquered, but its shadow still demanded caution, and so the machines disappeared into classified vaults. Inside Bletchley Park, the end of Enigma brought both relief and melancholy. The constant grind of intercept, decrypt, and analysis slowed as German signals dwindled. Analysts who had lived in a world of ceaseless pressure now faced the strange silence of victory. Some celebrated, others felt the anticlimax of work that had consumed their youth suddenly evaporating. For years they had read the enemy's heartbeat, anticipating his moves and shaping the war in shadows. Now that pulse was gone, replaced by silence, and the knowledge that their greatest secret would never be shared. Even as Europe erupted in celebration, Bletchley's halls remained subdued, their triumph hidden behind the Official Secrets Act. The end of Enigma did not bring fame or parades. It brought secrecy, restraint, and the quiet pride of those who knew. For them, victory meant vanishing into obscurity. The Germans never realized the full extent of their betrayal until long after the war. Many officers went to their graves convinced that Enigma had never been compromised. They believed their failures were due to overwhelming Allied material superiority, never understanding the role of cryptography. Only decades later did the truth emerge, rewriting the history of campaigns they had fought and lost. For the survivors, the revelation was both shocking and bitter, a reminder that their faith in technology had been misplaced. Hitler himself had placed absolute confidence in Enigma, trusting its complexity to outwit any enemy. His generals obeyed, transmitting plans that became roadmaps for their destruction. The irony was profound. The machine that symbolized German modernity had instead hastened their defeat. In the end, Enigma's collapse was not just a military failure, it was a monument to misplaced trust. The machines themselves did not vanish with the war, but continued their strange afterlife in secrecy. Many were seized by the Allies and repurposed, their security ironically still trusted by nations unaware of Bletchley's triumph. For years, governments across the world used Enigma machines, never suspecting that British and American intelligence could still read their traffic. This lingering legacy gave ultra-influence even in peacetime, a shadow stretching into the Cold War. Meanwhile, countless machines were destroyed, dumped into rivers or buried in rubble. Others ended up in museums, stripped of their secrecy, and presented as curiosities to the public. For Bletchley veterans, seeing them displayed decades later was both surreal and vindicating. Once these machines had ruled their lives, dictating every hour of every day. Now they sat silent, relics of a war fought in ciphers. Their rotors no longer turned, but their story endured. By May 1945, the story of Enigma had reached its end. though its secrets remained hidden for decades. The final decrypts recorded the collapse of German divisions, the surrender of U-boats, and the end of a war waged as much in silence as in fire. For those who had carried the burden of ultra, the victory was absolute yet invisible, their contribution erased from the public eye. The Reich was destroyed, and with it the illusion of invulnerable ciphers. The world had learned that no code, however complex, was unbreakable. But the men and women who had proven it could not speak their triumph. They faded back into ordinary lives, their genius buried beneath secrecy. The machines they had conquered became ghosts, scattered across history. And Enigma, once the symbol of German might, became the emblem of its downfall. The fall of Enigma did not simply mark the end of a wartime cipher, it marked the beginning of a new technological age. The relentless struggle to pierce German codes had driven mathematicians, engineers, and linguists into unprecedented collaboration. In the crucible of Bletchley Park, problems once thought insurmountable were solved with a mixture of intuition and machinery. The Bombe was not merely a machine of war, but a stepping stone toward something greater. Its logic, its wiring, its very conception hinted at the dawn of programmable computing. Alan Turing's vision, born of desperation, laid the foundation for the computer revolution that would shape the second half of the century. What had begun as a race to save convoys became the spark that ignited digital civilization. From vacuum tubes to silicon, the lineage can be traced back to the silent huts. Enigma's defeat was the genesis of modern information technology, and its legacy continues every time a processor hums to life. Alan Turing emerged as one of the most enduring figures of this hidden war. His brilliance recognized too late, and his life marked by tragedy. At Bletchley he had approached Enigma not as a puzzle, but as a system to be mechanized, an insight that gave birth to the Bombe. His ideas on algorithms and mechanical logic reached far beyond the battlefield, pointing toward universal machines capable of solving any problem. In later years, this vision would become the theoretical backbone of computer science, shaping disciplines from artificial intelligence to cybersecurity. Yet Turing's post-war years were scarred by persecution, his wartime service buried under secrecy and prejudice. For decades, the public never knew that one of the saviors of civilization had walked among them. Only with time did his contribution surface, elevating him as both a symbol of genius and of injustice. His legacy is etched not only in computing, but in the very notion of freedom itself. For in breaking Enigma, Turing proved that even the most rigid systems could be undone by imagination. And that lesson resonates still. The Cold War soon revealed that the war of codes had never truly ended. As new adversaries emerged, the lessons of Enigma guided the intelligence arms race. Cryptographic machines grew more sophisticated, their ciphers stronger, yet the hunger to break them only deepened. Governments poured resources into signals intelligence, founding institutions that traced their roots back to Bletchley Park. GCHQ in Britain and the NSA in America became heirs to ultra, wielding secrecy as both shield and weapon. Soviet ciphers replaced German ones, and the invisible battlefield of mathematics continued unabated. Satellites, radio intercepts, and early computers became the new weapons of this clandestine struggle. In a world divided by ideology, the codebreaker was as vital as the soldier or the spy. The Enigma War had proven that information could alter destiny, and that truth guided intelligence policy for generations to come. The shadow of Enigma also influenced how nations thought about secrecy and ethics. The dilemmas faced at Bletchley, how to use intelligence without exposing it, when to act and when to let men die, remained unsolved. In Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East, commanders faced the same burdens, though with newer tools. The balance between knowledge and concealment, between power and morality never disappeared. Instead, it became embedded in intelligence culture, a permanent inheritance of ultra. In the Cold War, secrecy was elevated to an art, with codebreaking and code-making locked in endless embrace. Civil liberties and privacy found themselves entangled with cryptography, as states sought dominance over communication itself. These tensions echo into the present, where every encrypted phone and secure server carries a trace of the Enigma legacy. What had once been wartime necessity became a permanent condition of modernity, and Enigma's ghost still lingers wherever secrecy meets power. Yet the story of Enigma is not only about machines, but about the people who wielded them. The mathematicians, the clerks, the linguists, and the countless women who filled Bletchley's huts carried the weight of secrecy long after the war ended. For decades, their silence was absolute, their contributions hidden even from their families. Only when declassification began in the 1970s did the magnitude of their achievement emerge. By then, many had passed away, never recognized for saving millions of lives. Those who remained told their stories with humility, often describing themselves as small cogs in a vast machine. But history now sees them differently, as the quiet heroes of a war fought in logic and language, in ink and electricity. Their work reshaped not only the course of the war, but the entire trajectory of the 20th century. Enigma was their crucible, and their legacy is written in every byte of our digital world. Enigma also became a powerful symbol in public memory. Its machines displayed in museums as relics of secrecy and genius. For visitors, the rows of rotors and lamps evoke awe, yet the true weight lies in the knowledge they concealed. Each machine represents the paradox of modern war, the union of cold technology with human courage and imagination. Films, books, and documentaries have sought to capture the drama, turning Enigma into an icon of mystery and discovery. Yet even in popular culture, the story retains a sense of reverence, for it speaks of intellect defeating tyranny. The memory of Enigma bridges generations, reminding us that wars are not won only by strength of arms, but by strength of mind. It is a story of hidden rooms, of whispered calculations, of unsung sacrifice, and it lingers as one of the great legends of the Second World War. The machine that promised invulnerability became the emblem of vulnerability itself, and its defeat stands as a monument to human ingenuity. From a technical standpoint, the legacy of Enigma reshaped cryptography itself, inspiring the development of new codes resistant to similar attacks. The realization that no cipher is unbreakable pushed mathematicians to explore entirely new branches of number theory. This journey led eventually to public key cryptography, digital signatures, and the secure communications that defined the modern internet. The road from rotors to RSA is long, but its starting point lies in the lessons of Ultra. Security, once thought to be a matter of complexity, was revealed to be a matter of design, discipline, and constant vigilance. Cryptography became not just a military concern, but the foundation of global commerce, diplomacy, and privacy. And each innovation bore the shadow of those wartime discoveries. In this way, Enigma continues to protect, as well as to haunt. The machine's destruction birthed an entire field of science, and that field now underpins our connected world. In the end, the story of Enigma is both a triumph and a warning. It proves that no wall of secrecy, however intricate, can withstand determination, creativity, and sacrifice. It shows that technology, once thought unassailable, can become a trap for those who trust it too deeply. It reminds us that wars are fought not only in trenches and skies, but in the quiet corners of human imagination. And it leaves us with the legacy of those who labored in silence, changing the world without recognition. From the ashes of war rose the dawn of computing, intelligence, and the digital age. The victory over Enigma was not just a chapter in history, it was a turning point for humanity itself. Today, every encrypted message, every algorithm, every server carries its echo. We live in a world built upon that silent triumph, and in the hum of every machine, we can still hear the faint click of Enigma's rotors.